The story of Ramses the Great begins beneath the golden haze of the New Kingdom sun, a time when Egypt reigned as the jewel of the ancient world. The Nile ran deep and sure, its floods feeding fields of emerald grain, its banks lined with the white walls of temples glinting under the endless blue. The year was around 1303 BCE, in the reign of Pharaoh Seti I, and within the palace at Avaris, a child's first cry mingled with the hymns of priests. They named him Ramses. Ra has begotten him, a name destined to echo through eternity. Even as an infant, the signs of divinity seemed to shimmer around him. Royal scribes recorded omens, the rising of Sirius in perfect harmony with the day of his birth, the lotus blooming at dawn by the palace pool. For the Egyptians, these were not coincidences, they were celestial endorsements, whispers of destiny. The courtiers told Seti that the boy would bring everlasting fame to the royal line. Yet in that moment, Ramses was simply a son, nestled in his mother Tuya's arms, unaware of the weight of the world that awaited him. Seti, I was a ruler of order and discipline. His reign had begun the restoration of Egypt's empire after years of neglect and foreign unrest. He fought the Libyans to the west, the Syrians to the north, and the Nubians to the south. His court hummed with ambition and the scent of fresh limestone from the great construction projects rising along the Nile. In the midst of it all, the boy Ramses grew up, surrounded by the rhythm of command. From the moment he could walk, he was steeped in ceremony, his small footsteps echoing across temple floors, his laughter mingling with the low chanting of priests offering incense to Amun. When Ramses was 5, he stood beside his father during a festival procession in Thebes. The heat shimmered over the white stone courtyards, and the drums of the soldiers beat like thunder. His father's tall, gold-crowned figure seemed to merge with the sun itself, and Ramses watched in awe as the people bowed to him. It was then, perhaps, that he first understood what it meant to be divine in the eyes of men. He did not see a mortal father, but a god who ruled the earth. That image burned into his heart, a model he would one day surpass. Seti, I saw promise in his son. The boy's bearing was regal, his gaze steady and fearless. Tutors were summoned from every corner of the empire. Mathematicians, priests, military captains, scribes versed in the mysteries of hieroglyphs. Under their watch, Ramses learned to read the sacred texts, to trace the flow of the Nile's floods in meticulous ink, to calculate rations for armies, and to wield bow and chariot with the precision of a hunter. His mornings were spent in study, his afternoons in the palace yards, driving chariots until his arms ached and his skin darkened in the sun. His mother, Queen Tuya, taught him gentleness, where his father demanded strength. She spoke of Ma'at, the sacred balance that held the universe together, the harmony of truth, justice, and order. A pharaoh must rule not with fear alone, she told him, but with the grace of Ra's light, warming even those who dwell in shadow. Ramses never forgot. The dual teachings of Seti's iron and Tuya's light became the twin pillars of his character: force and compassion, pride and reverence. As a child of the royal house, he lived surrounded by beauty beyond imagination. Perfumed gardens bloomed beside the palace pools, filled with papyrus reeds and white lotus. Musicians played flutes and harps at dusk, their melodies floating through corridors painted with stories of gods and kings. Gold gleamed from every surface on the thrones, the altars, even the collars of the cats that roamed the halls. Yet the world beyond the palace walls fascinated Ramses even more. On rare outings with his father, he would ride through the crowded streets of Memphis, or along the docks where barges brought cedar and copper from foreign lands. He listened to the hum of his people, the potters, the farmers, the soldiers, and felt their gaze upon him. He was the living promise of Egypt's future. By the time he turned 10, Ramses had already been introduced to the army. Seti I, ever the commander, wanted his son to see the reality of power, not just the ceremonies, but the grit behind them. The boy was given a small chariot team and a detachment of young soldiers to train beside. Day after day, he watched the veterans spar with spears, mend armor, and march in tight formation under the relentless sun. The rhythm of drums and the scent of dust and sweat became familiar companions. He practiced tirelessly, and when he could finally draw his bow to full tension and strike a distant target, his father smiled with pride. "You will not merely rule Egypt," Seti said. "You will defend her." Ramses's education also extended to diplomacy and religion, for no pharaoh ruled by the sword alone. In the cool chambers of the Temple of Ptah, priests showed him how offerings were made to appease the gods. He learned to speak with humility before the statues of deities who, it was said, listened to every word. He stood before the colossal image of Amun-Ra and whispered prayers, not as a child of privilege, but as one chosen to bridge heaven and earth. The awareness that divine eyes were always upon him became both comfort and burden, a presence that guided every act. When he was 15, Seti named him Prince of the Army. It was an unprecedented honor for one so young. With it came responsibilities that tested his resolve. He began accompanying Seti on campaigns into Canaan and Nubia. The desert winds scorched his face, and the sight of distant enemies stirred both fear and exhilaration. He watched his father lead thousands through the valleys, chariots cutting across the plains, banners rippling like fire. In these moments, Ramses absorbed the rhythm of command, the timing, the signals, the unspoken language between king and soldier. On one of these journeys, legend says Ramses was nearly struck by an enemy arrow during a skirmish. A soldier shielded him, taking the wound in his stead. That night, as the fires flickered and the wounded groaned in their tents, Ramses walked among them, speaking softly, bringing water with his own hands. He realized then that to be a great ruler was not only to be obeyed but to be loved. Power alone could win battles, but devotion could build empires. Seti saw in his son a reflection of himself and perhaps something greater. He began entrusting Ramses with command decisions, allowing him to oversee the repair of fortresses, the training of new recruits, the supervision of temple works. The young prince proved capable, decisive, and ambitious. He relished the weight of authority and the chance to leave his mark. Yet even then, he dreamed of something larger than duty. In his heart burned an image, a vision of eternity carved in stone, his name enduring as long as the sun rose over the Nile. Egypt in Ramses's youth was a land both prosperous and wary. The great Hittite Empire pressed from the north, the Libyans from the west, and the Nubians from the south. Seti maintained balance through force and diplomacy, but he knew the task would one day fall to his son. So he taught Ramses the delicate art of rule, when to strike and when to wait, when to promise peace and when to demand tribute. At night, father and son would sit together under the stars on the palace terrace. The Nile shimmered like a mirror below, reflecting the constellations that the priests said were the souls of pharaohs past. Seti would point toward the horizon and speak of legacy. "The kingdom is not yours, my son," he would say. "It belongs to eternity. We borrow it only to shape it, then return it to those who come after. Rule with wisdom, and the gods will remember your name." Ramses listened, his heart swelling with a mixture of awe and determination. He promised himself that he would not only uphold his father's legacy, he would surpass it. He would build temples that kissed the sky, lead armies that tamed empires, and etch his face into the mountains so that even the desert winds would whisper his name. By 17, his destiny was no longer in question. The priests spoke of divine favor surrounding him, the army revered him as a prodigy, and the people cheered whenever his chariot passed. The child who once played by the lotus ponds of Avaris had become a figure of power and myth. Every step he took seemed to echo with the footsteps of ancestors long gone, as though the gods themselves were walking beside him. And so, under the blazing Egyptian sun, the boy who would be God looked toward the horizon, not with the wonder of a child, but with the certainty of a ruler, already aware of his immortality, waiting to be claimed. The empire awaited him. The gods awaited him. History itself awaited him. Apprentice of power. Ramses had grown from the golden child of the palace into a young man tempered by discipline, sharpened by expectation, and haloed in the glow of divine promise. Egypt, during his adolescence, was at the height of its might, its granaries swollen with grain, its temples humming with life, its banners fluttering from Nubia to the Levant. Yet within that strength lay constant vigilance. For Egypt's empire was not a tranquil sea, it was a storm held in balance by Seti I's will, a dominion that required both sword and mind to maintain. And Ramses, as heir apparent, had to master them both. He rose before the dawn, long before the priests began their hymns to Ra. The air was cool, tasting faintly of dust and river mist. He trained with the charioteers in the palace courtyard, the sound of hooves beating rhythmically on packed earth. Each morning he mounted his chariot, gripping the reins with raw hands, steering the twin horses as the sun burst over the horizon. His arms tensed against the pull, his hair whipped by the desert wind, his eyes locked on the distant target, a wooden dummy shaped like a warrior. Arrows hissed through the air, striking again and again with unerring accuracy. The instructors nodded silently. The boy's precision bordered on divine. When the sun reached its zenith, he studied. The scribes taught him the mathematics of supply routes and the hieroglyphic art of royal decree. He learned how to balance temple accounts, how to distribute grain during lean floods, and how to read the subtle diplomacy of tribute lists from vassal kings. At night, he sat beside the high priests who whispered to him the sacred formulas that bound the gods to the state. His education was not that of a prince, it was that of a living institution. Ramses was being sculpted into Egypt itself, every lesson another chisel stroke shaping the figure of destiny. Seti I was a stern mentor. He would test his son not through affection but through expectation. When Ramses erred, Seti corrected him with silence rather than anger, a silence heavier than any reprimand. The young prince learned to read that quiet as judgment, and it drove him harder than praise ever could. "If you falter," Seti once said during a march across the desert, 1,000 men falter with you. The Nile does not forgive those who lead it astray. Those words would echo in Ramses's mind for decades, a creed of duty engraved deeper than stone. By his 16th year, the prince's education expanded from the walls of the palace to the reaches of empire. Seti summoned him to accompany military campaigns. The empire's northern frontiers were restless. The Hittites in Anatolia sought to dominate the trade routes that fed Egypt's wealth, and rebellious Canaanite cities tested their allegiance. Ramses would learn the art of rule not from scrolls, but from the roar of battle and the dust of marching feet. Their first great campaign together took them into Canaan. The march began at dawn, a river of men stretching across the sands, chariots glinting in the sun, banners snapping in the hot wind. Ramses rode at his father's side, clad in bronze and gold, the plumes of his helmet trembling like flame. The terrain was harsh, dry wadis, jagged hills, and the endless weight of heat pressing down on every breath. Yet Ramses did not falter. He learned to read the land, to sense ambushes from the silence of birds, to judge when to rest the men and when to strike fast before the enemy could gather. In the fortress towns they captured, he observed how Seti treated victory not only as conquest, but as theatre. Captives were paraded, offerings made to Amun, and inscriptions carved before the blood had even dried. Every triumph was immortalized in stone, each a reminder to friend and foe alike that Egypt's arm was long and unbroken. The lesson was clear to Ramses. A pharaoh's true weapon was memory. Power was fleeting. Monuments were eternal. He also learned the delicate language of diplomacy. Seti's scribes would meet with emissaries under the fluttering banners of truce, their words veiled in ritual. Ramses would stand silently beside his father, studying every gesture, every tone. He saw how Seti offered peace with one hand while tightening Egypt's grip with the other. Tribute flowed in the form of gold, cedar, and lapis lazuli, but beneath the gifts was submission. The world bent before Egypt's grandeur, and Ramses vowed that one day it would bend before his own name. In Nubia, to the south, the lessons grew harsher. The heat was brutal, the terrain treacherous. Ramses watched as the Egyptian armies subdued the tribes that resisted tribute. He rode at the front lines, the wind burning his face, his spear poised. In one skirmish, his chariot nearly overturned as his horses stumbled on rocky ground, but the young prince steadied them, loosed his arrow, and struck down a Nubian warrior mid-charge. The soldiers cheered, chanting his name. From that day, Ramses was not just heir to the throne, he was a warrior in his own right. The campaign ended in victory. Nubia was secured, its leaders brought before Seti in chains, and then pardoned in a show of mercy that blended politics with piety. Ramses saw the ceremony unfold, the kneeling chiefs bowing before the golden throne, and understood how mercy could conquer where fear alone could not. In the evening, he and his father offered incense to the gods of victory. The air was thick with sandalwood and the echo of chants. The young prince gazed into the flame and imagined his own reflection there, a king crowned by destiny, his reign stretching beyond mortality. Back in Egypt, Ramses's responsibilities deepened. Seti appointed him overseer of works, a post of immense importance. The prince now commanded thousands of artisans, stonecutters, and labourers who toiled to complete the temples at Karnak and Abydos. Ramses walked among them, the scent of dust and wet plaster thick in the air. He studied the architecture, learning how every block fit with cosmic purpose. Each temple was not just a structure, but a statement of harmony, its walls aligned to the stars, its halls echoing the myth of creation. He learned to respect the craftsmen who carved eternity from limestone. He would pause beside them, watching chisels spark under sunlight, listening to the rhythmic hammering that seemed like the heartbeat of Egypt itself. Some workers murmured prayers as they worked. Others sang old hymns to Ptah, the god of artisans. Ramses spoke to them not as a distant prince, but as a fellow builder. He understood that the greatness of a pharaoh was built by many hands, and that their devotion could make his glory last forever. The people began to love him. When he passed through villages along the Nile, they called out blessings, showering lotus petals before his chariot wheels. Mothers lifted children to see his face. "He is like the son of Ra," they whispered, "the young god who will never fade." The priests, too, began to take notice, weaving his image into hymns and festival processions beside that of his father. The legend of Ramses was already beginning to take shape, woven into the tapestry of belief and power that sustained the empire. But even as fame grew, Ramses's burden deepened. The closer he drew to the throne, the more he saw of its cost. He witnessed the weight that settled on Seti's shoulders, the endless petitions, the reports of border raids, the delicate balance of temple politics. He saw the loneliness that came with godhood, the isolation of a man worshipped but never truly known. It did not deter him, it merely steeled his resolve. He believed he could bear it all, that he was born to. During one great festival of Opet in Thebes, Ramses stood before the statue of Amun, as it was carried from Karnak to Luxor along the river. The night glowed with 1,000 torches, the reflection of flame rippling across the water. Music echoed, drums rolled, and the scent of myrrh filled the air. As the statue passed, the priests intoned blessings for Egypt's eternal prosperity. Ramses felt a shiver of destiny, an invisible thread tightening around him, binding him to the divine order of things. He would not merely inherit his father's throne, he would embody the will of the gods themselves. Soon after, tragedy struck within the royal court. Seti's health began to waver. The campaigns had taken their toll, the years of strain visible in his once commanding frame. Ramses, barely 20, was called more frequently to the council chambers, where generals and priests now looked to him for leadership. It was a quiet transition, the passing of authority from one generation to the next, not yet formal but undeniable. The prince handled it with steady grace, commanding respect not through decree but through presence. When Seti died, Egypt entered a period of mourning unlike any in living memory. Bells tolled from the temples. The people lined the riverbanks in silent grief. Ramses led the funeral procession, clad in white linen, his eyes shadowed by solemn resolve. He watched as his father's sarcophagus was sealed and lowered into the tomb at Abydos, its walls painted with scenes of divine ascension. As the torches dimmed, Ramses pressed his hand to the cool stone and whispered a vow, though none could hear it. He would not let his father's light fade. He would build upon it until the gods themselves bowed before the name of Ramses. In the days that followed, he stood upon the palace balcony at Pyramses, the city that would soon bear his own name, and gazed out over the floodplain. The Nile glimmered like liquid gold, winding through fields of green. The cries of cranes echoed in the distance, and the air smelled of earth and life renewed. He felt the pulse of Egypt beneath his feet, vast and eternal, and knew that every grain of sand, every heartbeat, every hymn, belonged now to him. He was no longer Apprentice. The boy who had studied under the shadow of Seti now stood alone before the horizon of history, poised to seize it. The lessons of war and governance, the weight of divine kingship, the echoes of his father's counsel, all fused within him into a single purpose. The gods had shaped him, the land had tested him, and now destiny awaited. The young lion was ready to roar, and the world would hear him for millennia to come. The coronation of the eternal sun. The morning of Ramses's coronation dawned like no other. Across the length of Egypt, from the cataracts of Nubia to the harbours of the Delta, the air itself seemed to shimmer with expectation. The Nile flowed in solemn calm, its waters tinted by the rising sun, as though touched by molten gold. Priests in white linen moved like silent phantoms along the temple avenues, burning incense that curled upward into the pale sky. The scent of myrrh, cedar, and lotus hung thick in the morning air. It was the day a mortal would become divine, the day Ramses, son of Seti, ascended as Pharaoh, lord of the two lands, living image of Ra. Inside the great temple of Amun at Karnak, light spilled through columns carved with the deeds of kings long past. The air was cool and heavy with centuries of devotion. Ramses entered barefoot, his body anointed in sacred oils that gleamed upon his skin like burnished bronze. Around his neck hung a broad collar of lapis, carnelian, and gold. He walked slowly down the central aisle, flanked by priests chanting the ancient hymns of coronation. The deep drums echoed with a rhythm that felt older than time, the heartbeat of Egypt itself. Before him waited the statue of Amun-Ra, the hidden god, the father of kings. As the high priest raised his arms and recited the sacred words, Ramses bowed low. In that moment, the ceremony transcended pageantry. He felt the weight of all who had come before, the long line of pharaohs stretching back to Narmer, the first unifier of the two lands. The temple torches flickered as though stirred by unseen wind. When Ramses rose again, he was no longer merely the son of Seti, he was Egypt incarnate. The golden crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, the pshent, was lowered onto his head. The white of the south, the red of the north, the unification of heaven and earth bound upon his brow. The high priest's voice rose above the chanting. "Behold, Ramses, beloved of Amun, chosen of Ra, ruler of the two lands, eternal as the sun." The words rolled like thunder through the columns. Trumpets blared, and the crowd beyond the temple walls erupted in jubilation. When Ramses stepped out onto the temple terrace, a sea of humanity stretched before him. Tens of thousands filled the avenue, faces lifted, eyes gleaming with devotion. Petals rained from balconies, Drums thundered, and banners of gold and crimson rippled in the wind. The young pharaoh stood bathed in sunlight, the crown blazing like fire. He raised his scepter, the crook and flail, symbols of rule and responsibility, and the crowd roared. Life, prosperity, health, forever. At 20 years of age, he had become the living bridge between gods and men. Yet behind the brilliance of ceremony lay the vast machinery of rule now placed upon his shoulders. Egypt was a vast and complex empire, its wealth unmatched, its borders sprawling across deserts, mountains, and seas. It demanded vigilance, strategy, and divine confidence. The pharaoh was not only king, he was the axis of the world, the point upon which Ma'at, the cosmic order, balanced. If he faltered, chaos would seep through the cracks of creation itself. Ramses understood the magnitude of that burden, but he did not shrink from it. He welcomed it. In his mind, he had been born for this his entire life, a preparation for this single moment. Every lesson from Seti, every campaign, every scar, every night spent staring at the stars and wondering what immortality required, all of it had led here. The priests might have crowned him, but destiny itself had chosen him. The celebrations lasted for days. Processions wound through Thebes, carrying images of the gods on gilded barges. The temple dancers moved like flowing water, their anklets chiming in rhythm with the flutes. Offerings filled the sanctuaries: honey, wine, bread, gold, and incense in quantities so vast that the air seemed saturated with sweetness. At dusk, the torches reflected in the Nile, turning its waters into a living ribbon of fire. Ramses presided over it all, seated upon the throne of Horus, his eyes steady, his posture still as carved stone. Yet within, his mind raced with visions of what must come next. He would not be content merely to inherit his father's achievements. He would elevate Egypt beyond memory. He would build monuments so great that even the gods would pause to gaze upon them. He would bring order where the frontiers trembled, expand the boundaries of empire until they touched the horizon, and inscribe his name upon every stone that kissed the sun. When the festival ended, the coronation marked not just the beginning of his reign, but the beginning of a new era, a rebirth of empire. He summoned his council of generals, scribes, and architects. Among them stood men who had served under Seti, veterans of old wars and stewards of ancient traditions. Ramses listened to their reports with calm attentiveness. The western border faced new Libyan incursions. The northern vassals in Syria wavered between loyalty and rebellion, and trade along the sea routes faltered under Hittite interference. The young pharaoh's eyes, bright as polished amber, gleamed with purpose. Egypt, he declared, would rise once more to unmatched glory. His first act of rule was symbolic yet decisive. He ordered the completion of his father's unfinished temple at Abydos, ensuring Seti's soul would ascend peacefully to the field of reeds. He personally oversaw the inscriptions, insisting that his father's name be honoured beside his own, a gesture of filial piety that resonated throughout the land. It told the people that though a new sun now ruled the heavens, it still shone upon the legacy of the old. The gods, it was said, smiled upon this harmony. Then came the rebuilding of the army. Ramses expanded it beyond any force Egypt had ever commanded. Barracks rose in the delta, forges blazed, and chariot wheels thundered day and night. The pharaoh himself drilled with his men, his body hardened by years of training. He led mock charges across the sands, his horses adorned with plumes and gold, his bow striking targets with unerring precision. Soldiers whispered that he fought like the god Montu reborn, fearless and tireless. But Ramses knew that might alone was not enough. To secure Egypt's future, he needed vision. He began to invest in the infrastructure of empire fortresses along the borders, irrigation canals to sustain the farmlands, granaries to store the Nile's bounty. He sent emissaries to distant lands, reviving old alliances, reopening trade with Byblos and Cyprus, ensuring that copper, timber, and incense flowed steadily into Egypt's hands. Every corner of his realm pulsed with new energy, like the veins of a body renewed. In the midst of his growing responsibilities, Ramses also turned toward the spiritual. He visited temples across the land, performing rituals to reaffirm the sacred link between himself and the gods. The priests recorded each ceremony, declaring that the new pharaoh's favor was evident in the overflowing Nile, the abundant harvests, the peace among the people. His image appeared on temple walls, depicted beside Ra, their faces nearly indistinguishable, the mortal and divine intertwined. In private, Ramses often returned to the teachings of his mother, Tuya. She had told him that true greatness came not only from conquest but from harmony. And so, amidst his military reforms, he also sought beauty. Artists were commissioned to craft new sculptures, poets to compose hymns of his reign, architects to design temples that embodied the perfection of the cosmos. He believed that beauty itself was a form of order, a reflection of Ma'at. To build magnificence was to please the gods, and through that, to ensure eternity. As his rule gained momentum, the world beyond Egypt began to take notice. Envoys from distant lands brought gifts and tributes: lapis from Babylon, ivory from Cush, cedar from Lebanon. They came not merely to honor a king, but to witness the rising star of a young ruler whose ambition shone like a second sun. And yet, in the north, the Hittite Empire watched with wary eyes. Their king, Muwatalli II, understood what the resurgence of Egypt might mean. Between these two great powers stretched the volatile lands of Canaan and Syria, a chessboard upon which the future of the ancient world would be decided. For now, Ramses's focus remained within. He toured the kingdom by royal barge, journeying from Memphis to Thebes, through fields of rippling grain and cities bustling with life. Wherever he went, the people rejoiced. They lined the river banks, waving palm branches, chanting blessings. The sight stirred something deep within him, a love not only for power, but for the land itself. The scent of wet clay after the flood, the shimmering reflection of temples at dusk, the cries of children playing by the river, these were the heartbeat of Egypt, the reason for everything he would do. At night, when the festivals quieted and the torches flickered low, Ramses would stand upon his palace balcony. The stars above glittered in their eternal silence, and the moon traced silver across the Nile. He would look toward the horizon and imagine the centuries to come. He saw temples yet unbuilt, cities bearing his name, his face carved upon mountains, so that even when the world turned to dust, Ramses the Great would endure. He felt both small and infinite beneath that sky, a man bound by mortality, yet driven by the dream of eternity. And perhaps in that moment, the gods, watching from the unseen heavens, whispered their approval. For they had found in him not merely a ruler, but a reflection of themselves, a being who sought to master time itself. Thus began the reign of Ramses II, the eternal Sunday. His light had only just risen, but already the world trembled in its glow. The rise of the warrior pharaoh, the dawn of Ramses's reign had passed into its second decade, and Egypt once again stood as a beacon of might and majesty across the ancient world. The Nile shimmered with abundance, temples thrummed with hymns to the new Sun King, and the soldiers of Egypt sharpened their spears beneath the unblinking desert sky. Yet beyond its golden borders, the world was stirring. In the shadowed north, the Hittite Empire gathered strength, their kings dreaming of dominion over the same lands that Egypt claimed. Between them stretched the contested fields of Canaan and Syria, a web of rebellious city-states and shifting loyalties. Ramses II, still in the full vigour of youth, would not let that challenge pass unanswered. He had inherited from Seti not just the throne, but the mission of securing Egypt's supremacy beyond its borders. Now, with his armies swelling in number and his confidence rising like the floodwaters of the Nile, Ramses prepared to lead them. He would become not merely a ruler of Egypt, but a conqueror in the mould of the gods themselves. The call to arms went forth from Pyramses, the new capital he was raising in the delta. The city was already a marvel, broad avenues lined with colonnades, gardens perfumed with acacia, and workshops alive with the sound of bronze being hammered into chariot fittings. It was both palace and fortress, designed to be the beating heart of empire. And from its gates, the armies of Egypt began to move. They were an awe-inspiring sight. 4 great divisions of men, each named for a god: Amun, Ra, Ptah, and Set. Their banners rippled like living flame beneath the desert sun. The chariots gleamed with bronze fittings, their horses adorned with plumes dyed crimson and gold. The soldiers wore linen kilts, their skin darkened by sun and dust, their eyes burning with the pride of serving under the most glorious king in living memory. The pharaoh himself led them, standing tall in his gilded chariot, the double crown shining like fire above his brow. Ramses had trained his army with precision, blending ceremony with strategy. He was not content to rely on old traditions alone. Scouts, spies, and supply lines were reorganized. New forges produced stronger weapons. The chariots were refitted to carry more speed and stability. The army was not only vast, it was efficient, disciplined, and infused with belief. They did not fight for mere conquest, but for a god-king whose glory would outlast their lives. The first campaigns struck south into Nubia once more, reaffirming Egypt's dominion and securing the gold mines that fueled its wealth. The resistance there was brief. The southern lands had long bowed to Egyptian power, but Ramses understood the value of demonstration. He built temples in Nubia not just as symbols of worship, but as warnings to the world. Egypt's hand was unyielding. The Nubian chiefs were brought in procession before him, their arms laden with tribute, their loyalty sealed in gold and stone. Then Ramses turned his eyes northward toward the restless lands of Canaan and Syria, where his father had once campaigned. The Hittites had extended their reach there, building alliances among local rulers. Egypt's vassal states wavered, sensing opportunity in the shifting winds of power. The young pharaoh saw in this both danger and destiny. He would march forth to reclaim what had once been Seti's, and perhaps to claim even more. The campaign began in the heat of summer. Ramses's army crossed the desert roads like a storm cloud, the rumble of chariot wheels echoing through the wadis. They advanced city by city, their standards gleaming with divine symbols. Towns that resisted were swiftly taken, their walls pulled down, their rulers brought in chains. Yet Ramses was not merely a destroyer. He spared the conquered when it suited his purpose, offering peace and prosperity in exchange for allegiance. Those who bowed were granted Egypt's protection, those who defied him were erased. It was a simple law, the law of empire. The march north took months, the rhythm of war becoming a pulse that beat through the land. Each victory was recorded by royal scribes, each city's fall immortalized in hieroglyphs that proclaimed Ramses's greatness. But it was not victory alone that defined him, it was the aura of divinity he carried. To his soldiers, he was not a man among them, but a blazing force of destiny. When he rode into battle, golden armor flashing beneath the sun, the men said they saw the very image of Ra descending upon his enemies. The pharaoh's camp was a world unto itself. At night, fires glowed across the dunes, their light dancing over tents adorned with royal insignia. Musicians played harps and drums to keep morale high, while scribes recorded the events of the day with delicate strokes upon papyrus. Ramses would often walk among his men, speaking little but radiating presence. He was young, strong, and confident, his face calm, even when the winds howled through the tents. The soldiers took courage in his composure. They believed that where Ramses went, the gods themselves followed. And perhaps they were right, for in every battle, he seemed to defy chance itself. Outside Gaza, his chariots broke through fortified walls that had resisted for generations. In Amurru, he captured the rebel prince with a daring night assault that would be sung in Egyptian courts for decades. His victories multiplied. each one adding to the legend that would soon sweep across both friend and foe. The Hittites began to take notice. Their spies returned with stories of the young lion of Egypt, of his tireless marches, his divine charisma, his unbroken line of triumphs. The name of Ramses began to stir unease in the north. Yet it was not only his sword that expanded Egypt's reach, it was his pen. Ramses understood that empires were built not merely by force, but by the stories told about them. After each victory, he ordered scribes and artists to inscribe his triumphs upon the walls of temples. Scenes of him smiting enemies, standing tall before the gods, became the sacred language of power. Even as he fought in distant lands, artisans back in Thebes and Memphis were carving his glory into eternity. Years of campaigning hardened him. He became leaner, stronger, his hands calloused by reins and sword hilt alike. His eyes, once filled with youthful wonder, now held the steady focus of command. Yet beneath the iron of leadership still beat the heart of the dreamer, the boy who had once gazed upon the statues of gods and vowed to join their ranks. Each victory brought him closer to that impossible goal, to transcend the boundary between mortal and divine. His return to Egypt after these early campaigns was triumphant. The people lined the streets of Thebes to greet him, shouting his name in waves of adoration. The royal barges glided along the Nile, their sails painted with scenes of conquest. Captives from foreign lands marched in chains behind, offering tribute. Priests poured libations to the gods as Ramses entered the temple of Amun, where he knelt before the altar and declared that Egypt was secure. The chants of thanksgiving echoed into the night. But even amidst celebration, Ramses's mind turned toward the horizon, for he knew that the struggle for Canaan was far from over. The Hittites would not rest. The two greatest powers of the age were now on a collision course, destined to clash in a battle that would echo across eternity. Still, before the storm came, peace, a brief, golden calm. Ramses returned to Pyramses, where the great palaces were nearing completion. He walked through the halls of polished stone, their walls engraved with lotus and papyrus motifs, and felt the satisfaction of creation. The scent of cedar and incense filled the air, mingling with the sound of distant forges. Here was the center of the world. He was building a city that would rival Thebes in splendor, a monument not only to his rule but to the idea of Egypt eternal. In the quiet hours of night, the pharaoh stood upon the terrace, gazing northward. Beyond the darkness lay the lands of his rivals, the Hittites, the Mitanni, the restless princes of Syria. He thought of Seti's lessons, of the balance between patience and strength, yet within him burned a fire that would not be contained. He could feel destiny pressing upon him, urging him toward the next great test. He would not be content with mere dominion. He would carve his name upon the world itself. Soon, his armies would march again. Soon, the gods would bear witness to a battle unlike any other, a trial of courage, chaos, and divine will that would decide the fate of empires. The age of Seti had ended. The age of Ramses the Great had truly begun. The Battle of Kadesh. The year was around 1274 BCE. The sun rose blood-red over the sands of Canaan as the armies of Egypt moved north like a tide of bronze and gold. Their destination was the fortified city of Kadesh, perched on the Orontes River in what is now Syria, a city that had changed hands between Egypt and the Hittites for generations. For Ramses II, the time for rivalry had ended. The young pharaoh, now hardened by years of campaign and confident in his divine strength, would face the challenge directly. He would break the power of the Hittites and make the world understand that Egypt bowed to no rival. The preparations had been immense. The Egyptian army, one of the greatest ever assembled, was divided into 4 divisions, each bearing the name of a god. The division of Amun, Ramses's own elite guard, marched at the center. To the east moved Ra, fierce and disciplined. To the west, Ptah, strong and steady. And far behind, the division of Set, The Stormbringer followed as the reserve. Altogether they numbered over 20,000 men, supported by 2,000 chariots, sleek, swift, and deadly. From the city of Pyramses, they advanced across the delta, through the burning sands of Sinai, across the narrow passes of Canaan. The journey was long and arduous, the heat relentless, but the soldiers marched with faith, for they followed a god in flesh. Ramses himself rode in his chariot of gold, his horses gleaming like fire, their harnesses inlaid with turquoise and silver. Upon his chest he wore the pectoral of Ra, upon his head the double crown of the two lands. The royal scribes later wrote that his presence was as the rising sun upon the battlefield, blinding the eyes of his enemies. By the time they reached the plains south of Kadesh, the air shimmered with heat and tension. Ramses believed the Hittite forces were far to the north, still gathering. Scouts had reported that the city lay lightly defended, ripe for conquest. Confident, he advanced ahead of his main army with the division of Amun, eager to seize the initiative and claim glory for himself. But beneath the apparent calm of the plains, an ambush was already set. The Hittite king, Muwatalli II, had moved swiftly and secretly. His army, equal in strength to Egypt's, lay concealed beyond the hills west of Kadesh. Hidden within the forested ridges and wadis were over 3,000 chariots, heavier and larger than Egypt's, manned by 3 warriors each instead of 2. They waited in silence, the dust settling on their helmets, their horses restless beneath the weight of stillness. As Ramses's vanguard encamped by the river, the trap was sprung. Without warning, the ground trembled beneath the thunder of hooves. The Hittite chariots burst from the hills like a storm of iron, their bronze wheels cutting through the dust. The first wave smashed directly into the Egyptian camp. Men were thrown to the ground, tents shredded, chariots overturned in chaos. Ramses's officers shouted commands, drowned by screams and the roar of oncoming death. The suddenness of the attack fractured the order of the proud Amun division. Panic rippled like fire through dry grass. Yet in the heart of that chaos, Ramses did not waver. He seized his bow and mounted his chariot. His driver, loyal Menna, gripped the reins as the pharaoh drew his weapon. The royal inscriptions would later depict him alone, surrounded by thousands, his horses Victory in Thebes and Mut's content charging into the storm. Arrows flew from his bow like lightning, striking the foremost Hittite warriors. "I am like Baal in his fury," he cried, though the roar of battle drowned the words. Wherever his chariot wheeled, men fell, and for a moment the tide halted. But courage alone could not stop an avalanche. The Hittite chariots surged again, pressing Ramses's forces toward the river. Bodies fell into the shallows. The Nile's northern waters ran red. Messengers were sent to summon the other divisions, but they were far behind, days behind. The Pharaoh of Egypt, the god of men, found himself alone with only a handful of loyal guards between life and annihilation. The dust choked the sky. Bronze clashed against bronze. Ramses's armor gleamed with blood and sun. He drove his chariot again and again into the heart of the enemy, rallying his men, cutting through confusion with the sheer force of will. Later inscriptions, carved in towering hieroglyphs upon temple walls, would transform that desperate hour into legend. Ramses standing alone against the world, radiant with divine power, his arrows raining upon the Hittites until they broke. But the truth, as always, lay between glory and survival. It was not divine lightning that saved the pharaoh, it was the arrival of the delayed divisions. The division of Ptah, hearing distant thunder of battle, had hastened through the night. As they crested the dunes, they saw the chaos below and charged forward without hesitation. Their sudden arrival tore through the flanks of the Hittite forces, forcing them into disarray. The Hittite chariots, heavy and slow to turn, struggled against the lighter Egyptian machines. One by one, their formations crumbled. The attackers retreated toward the river, their own horses trampling the fallen as panic spread among them. When the dust settled, The plain of Kadesh was a graveyard of broken wood and shattered bronze. The Egyptian camp lay in ruins, but Ramses still stood. His chariot was battered, his face streaked with dirt and sweat, his armor dented, but his eyes were alight with a strange calm. He had faced death and emerged unbroken. In the eyes of his soldiers, he was no longer merely a king. He was a god proven by trial. That night, the fires burned low along the banks of the Orontes. The wounded groaned, and the air was thick with the scent of iron and smoke. Ramses stood alone beside the river, watching the reflection of flames dance upon the water. The roar of the battle still echoed in his ears. He knew that he had not destroyed the Hittites. The war remained unresolved, but he also knew that something far greater had been born that day, a myth, an idea, a symbol of eternal courage. In the months that followed, both sides would claim victory. Ramses's scribes, ever loyal, immortalized the battle in hymns and carvings that spanned the walls of temples from Abydos to Abu Simbel. In the poem of Pentor, the pharaoh himself spoke, "I was alone. None came to my aid. My strength was my father Amun. He made my arm strong. He was my shield." To his people, it was not exaggeration, it was truth. For a pharaoh's power lay as much in story as in sword. The Hittites, for their part, withdrew northward, claiming to have repelled Egypt's advance. Both armies, bloodied and exhausted, returned home. But though the war remained unresolved, the legend of Kadesh spread faster than truth. Across Egypt, storytellers recited the tale of Ramses the Great, who faced thousands alone and triumphed by divine will. Artists carved his image as the invincible warrior pharaoh, chariot raised, enemies crushed beneath his feet. The walls of Luxor and Karnak bore his likeness as a god of war, his eyes burning with immortal fire. In the silence of his palace, Ramses reflected on the day's events with a deeper understanding. The battle had taught him that empire was not won by arrogance nor lost by fear. It was balanced between courage and caution, ambition and humility. Kadesh was both victory and warning. He had touched the brink of destruction and returned. The gods had tested him and found him worthy. Years later, when he stood before the temple walls that bore his triumph, Ramses would trace his fingers across the carved lines of his own image and feel the pulse of eternity beneath his hand. He had faced the gods of war and survived. He had learned that immortality was not granted, it was seized, forged in the crucible of chaos. And so, in the aftermath of Kadesh, the young lion of Egypt became the seasoned ruler. The deserts still whispered his name. The Hittites still watched from afar. But the world now knew that Ramses the Great had risen not as a mortal king, but as a living legend, the eternal sun whose light no storm could extinguish. The Treaty of Brothers. The sands of Syria had drunk deeply of blood, yet no empire had claimed dominion. The Battle of Kadesh, though immortalized as triumph, had ended in uneasy stalemate. Egypt still held its prestige, but the Hittites had not been broken. Two lions now stood facing one another across the same stretch of contested earth, each exhausted yet unbowed. For years after the battle, both Ramses and the Hittite king Muwatalli II continued their dance of shadow and strength raids, skirmishes, and the endless hum of tension that rippled through the borderlands like a drawn bowstring. But time itself, that silent general, was reshaping the world. Muwatalli fell, and his successor Urhi-Teshub faced rebellion within his own house. The Hittite court, once united by ambition, began to fracture under its own weight. Egypt, though strong and prosperous, felt the strain of constant vigilance. Even a god-king must sleep, and even a divine army must rest its horses. As the years rolled forward, the fever of conquest gave way to something deeper, wiser, and perhaps more enduring. The war that began in pride would end in peace, the first of its kind recorded in human history. After Kadesh, Ramses turned inward, strengthening Egypt's heart even as his armies held its veins. He rebuilt the shattered fortresses of Canaan, and re-established the flow of tribute through the vassal cities of the Levant. His architects and scribes filled the land with his name, carving the story of Kadesh in colossal scenes across temple walls, his chariot charging into battle, his arrows cutting through ranks of foes, his arm raised in divine fury. The story was not merely history, it was proclamation. To all who saw it, Egypt's strength was unquestioned. Ramses's courage, immortalized in stone, became a living scripture of national pride. Yet, in private moments, perhaps even he knew the truth behind the myth. The war had been costly, the lives of thousands scattered like sand across the plains of Syria. Egypt had gained no new land, only glory. Ramses understood that power must sometimes bend to endure. And so, as seasons passed and his sons grew into men, he began to consider a different kind of conquest, one not of territory, but of harmony. The Hittites, too, had changed. After the death of Muwatalli, his brother Hattusili III seized the throne in a coup, overthrowing his nephew. It was a dangerous move that left the empire weakened and unstable. Hattusili needed legitimacy, recognition, and peace. Egypt was the only rival whose word could grant it. For decades, the two nations had traded spies and arrows. Now, they began to trade letters. Clay tablets sealed with royal insignias crossed deserts and mountains, carried by emissaries who risked heat and distance to bridge the gap between empires. The tone of these letters was cautious but respectful. Ramses wrote in the voice of one who had no equal. Hattusili replied with the patience of one who needed friendship more than pride. Slowly, carefully, diplomacy began to weave where war had frayed. In the 21st year of Ramses's reign, the great transformation took place. Messengers from the Hittite capital of Hattusa arrived at Pyramses, bearing a proposal unlike any the world had seen before, a formal treaty of peace and alliance between two great powers. The terms were extraordinary for their time. Each side pledged to end hostilities, to respect each other's territories, and to aid one another against internal rebellion or foreign invasion. Should fugitives flee across the borders, they would be returned unharmed. Should famine strike one empire, the other would send grain. It was a document of trust born from exhaustion, yet sanctified by necessity. When the treaty was read aloud in the great hall of Pyramses, Ramses listened in silence. The courtiers murmured approval. The priests saw divine order in its words. For the pharaoh, it was not submission but mastery, the art of ruling by wisdom rather than war. Egypt would remain supreme not only through might, but through diplomacy that echoed the balance of Ma'at itself. Soon after, the treaty was sealed. Two versions were made, one in Egyptian hieroglyphs, engraved upon silver, the other in Hittite cuneiform, pressed into clay. Each declared the same message, that Egypt and Hatti were no longer enemies, but brothers. The phrase, simple yet revolutionary, transcended conquest. It acknowledged equality between kings who had once fought for the same sky. The signing ceremony was an event of unprecedented grandeur. In the temple of Ra, incense coiled upward as priests invoked the gods of both lands, Amun of Thebes, Teshub of Hattusa, to witness the oath. Ramses stood resplendent in white and gold, his crown shimmering like flame beneath the torchlight. The Hittite envoys bowed low before him, their garments heavy with foreign embroidery, their faces carved with relief. The treaty was recited aloud, its words echoing through the columns. Between the great king of Egypt, Ramses, and the great king of Hatti, Hattusili, there shall be peace and brotherhood forever. No hostilities shall arise between them, for their lands are as one. Should any enemy threaten the brother, the other shall come to his aid. When the ceremony ended, the trumpets of Egypt sounded across the river. The crowd outside the temple cheered, for they believed their pharaoh had achieved what no warrior before him had done. He had ended an age of endless war without surrendering even an inch of pride. In the eyes of his people, Ramses had not merely fought like a god, he had reasoned like one. The treaty was dispatched northward to be enshrined in Hattusa, while copies in hieroglyphic form were carved upon the walls of Karnak and Thebes. Those inscriptions remain to this day a testament to the first recorded peace in human civilization, a covenant not of conquest but of continuity. Yet Ramses's diplomacy did not stop there. To seal the alliance, he agreed to a royal marriage, the union of Egypt's divine line with the daughters of Hatti. The first Hittite princess arrived years later, borne upon gilded litters and surrounded by attendants from the mountains of Anatolia. Her procession wound through the avenues of Pyramses, where the people watched in awe at the sight of foreign nobility welcomed as kin. The marriage was more than ceremony. It was the physical embodiment of peace. Soon, another princess would follow, cementing the alliance in blood and lineage. Within Egypt, the arrival of these queens brought whispers of curiosity. Their garments, their jewelry, their language, all were strange, shimmering with the perfume of distant lands. Yet Ramses treated them with honor as bridges between worlds. He bestowed upon the first the title Great Royal Wife, second only to his beloved Nefertari, who, though her beauty was fading with years, remained eternal in the pharaoh's heart. The peace brought prosperity. Trade flourished along the coasts. Grain flowed into Anatolia in exchange for silver and horses, and merchants spoke of a new age of stability. For Egypt, this meant more than comfort. It meant time to build, to dream, to carve eternity. The pharaoh who had faced death on the battlefield now turned his gaze toward creation. Temples rose higher, statues grew grander, cities flourished with art and music. The empire, once strained by war, now breathed as one vast organism under the eternal sun. And yet, Ramses never forgot Kadesh. It remained the fulcrum upon which his life had turned from reckless warrior to divine statesman, from fire to light. He had learned that immortality was not seized through blood alone, but through legacy. The Treaty of Peace was not weakness, it was mastery of time itself. For as long as Egypt endured, his name would be spoken not only as conqueror, but as the bringer of harmony. In his palace, amid the scent of incense and the soft rustle of linen, Ramses would sometimes unroll the clay copies of the treaty and trace the inscriptions with his hand. Each word was a mirror of his journey, a reflection of a man who had fought gods and men alike, only to find divinity not in destruction, but in understanding. Far away, in the mountains of Anatolia, Hattusili III likely did the same. Two kings, once enemies, now linked by ink and eternity. Their empires would one day crumble, their gods fade, their languages fall silent, but the idea they created would outlast them both. For in that age of bronze and stone, when men still carved their fates into the bones of the earth, two rulers had dreamed of something greater than conquest. They had forged the world's first brotherhood of peace, and in that fragile, sacred balance, the name of Ramses the Great shone brighter than ever, no longer merely the god of war, but the eternal guardian of harmony. The great builder awakes. The clang of hammers echoed through the Nile valley like the heartbeat of a living god. From sunrise to twilight, the air was filled with dust, music, and the low chanting of labourers as stone met chisel and eternity took shape. It was the sound of Egypt remaking itself. After years of war and diplomacy, Ramses the Great turned his gaze inward to creation rather than conquest. The time of the warrior had yielded to the age of the builder, and from the deserts of Nubia to the shores of the Mediterranean, the land became his canvas. In the years following the peace with the Hittites, Egypt entered a golden calm. The floods came on time, the harvests were plentiful, and the gods seemed content. Tribute flowed steadily into the treasury: copper from Cyprus, silver from Hatti, incense from Punt, ebony and gold from Nubia. With his empire secure, Ramses sought to transform prosperity into permanence. He would not merely rule Egypt, he would rebuild it in his own image. The dream began in Thebes, the spiritual heart of the two lands. At Karnak, the temple of Amun, the most sacred of Egypt's sanctuaries, had stood for centuries, a living chronicle of Pharaoh's past. Each ruler had added something: a pylon, a courtyard, a columned hall. Ramses would outshine them all. He expanded Karnak with towering obelisks and vast reliefs, his own figure carved colossal beside that of the gods. In one great hall, the columns rose like petrified papyrus stalks, their capitals blooming with lotus and palm. Light filtered through them like the breath of Ra himself, illuminating the inscriptions that declared Ramses beloved of Amun, ruler eternal, sun upon the earth. To the south, at Luxor, he ordered the completion of the great temple begun by Amenhotep III. Statues of himself, each over 60 feet high, guarded the entrance like living sentinels of stone. They stared eternally toward the horizon, where the Nile bent like a blue ribbon beneath the gold sky. Between their feet, priests passed daily in solemn procession, carrying incense and chanting hymns to the living god whose image they served. But even Thebes could not contain the scale of Ramses's vision. His heart burned for creation on a scale no mortal had ever imagined. He envisioned monuments that would defy both time and oblivion, temples carved not merely upon the earth but into its bones. And so his builders were sent south into the cliffs of Nubia, where the sands met the eternal river, to carve what would become his greatest masterpiece, Abu Simbel. The journey to that distant place took weeks. The landscape there was harsh and silent, broken only by the cry of hawks circling in the heat. Yet beneath the cliffs of sandstone, Ramses saw possibility. He pointed to the mountain and declared that the gods themselves would dwell within it. The architects bowed low, for they understood. This would not be a temple built for Ramses, it would be a temple of Ramses. Work began under the unforgiving sun. Thousands of labourers, masons, and artisans descended upon the cliffs. They cut deep into the rock face, carving chambers and corridors that burrowed like arteries into the mountain's heart. Dust hung in the air like mist. The rhythm of chisels echoed for miles. Years passed as the vision took form. 4 colossal statues of Ramses seated upon his throne, each taller than a palace, their gazes fixed upon the rising sun. Between their knees, smaller figures represented his family, his queen Nefertari, his sons and daughters, the eternal household of the divine. When the final veil of rock fell away, the monument stood as though born from the mountain itself. The entrance glowed golden in the dawn, and within, a sanctuary extended into shadow. At its farthest end, 4 seated gods awaited the light: Ra Horakhti, Amun-Ra, Ptah, and Ramses himself. Twice a year, on the days of his birth and coronation, the rising sun penetrated the temple, casting its rays deep into the inner chamber. All but Ptah, the god of the underworld, were illuminated. The others basked in the divine fire, and among them sat Ramses, touched by the light of heaven. It was not accident. It was architecture as theology, geometry as prayer. Abu Simbel became the living symbol of Ramses's reign, its scale a challenge to time, its symmetry a hymn to divine order. Pilgrims came from distant lands to gaze upon its majesty. Scribes wrote that when the wind passed through the colossi mouths, one could almost hear the breath of the pharaoh whispering through eternity. But Ramses's ambition did not end there. Across Egypt, projects bloomed like flowers after flood. In the delta, his capital Pyramses rose to completion, a city of grand boulevards and gleaming temples, surrounded by lush gardens and perfumed pools. It was a city built for the age of peace, yet guarded by walls of strength. Palaces stretched along its avenues, their walls inlaid with lapis and ivory. Fountains flowed in courtyards, musicians played beneath palm shade, and priests recorded festivals that lasted for days. The city became both throne and temple, a statement to the world that the sun had chosen its home. Further north, at Abu Rawash, new sanctuaries rose. In Memphis, Ramses commissioned colossal statues in his likeness, so vast that even in ruin they would astonish travelers for millennia. He rebuilt temples in the delta, restored shrines long neglected, and ordered inscriptions that tied his name to every sacred site, from Elephantine to the Mediterranean coast. The land itself became his autobiography. Every stone bore witness to his reign. Every column spoke his name. And through it all, Nefertari stood at his side, the queen who shone like the moon beside his son. To her, he dedicated one of his most exquisite creations, the small temple at Abu Simbel. Its facade mirrored that of the great temple, but this one honoured the goddess Hathor and Nefertari herself. 6 colossal statues stood guard, 4 of Ramses, 2 of his queen, equal in height. Never before had a pharaoh granted such honour to a consort. Inside, the walls glowed with painted reliefs of love and devotion, their colours deep as jewels, their brushstrokes delicate as breath. In one, Ramses presents offerings to Hathor. In another, Nefertari plays the sistrum, her face serene, her eyes eternal. The people of Egypt saw these wonders rise and knew their god-king's favour was upon them. The economy flourished as artisans, craftsmen, and farmers found purpose in the pharaoh's works. Stonecutters from Aswan, goldsmiths from Thebes, painters from Memphis, all lent their skills to the living miracle of creation. Temples brought employment, food, and celebration. The empire became one vast workshop for eternity. At night, when the fires of the work camps flickered along the riverbanks, Ramses would sometimes ride out alone upon the desert ridges, accompanied only by a few guards. From those heights he could see the glow of torches scattered across the valley, the Nile flowing silver in the moonlight, and the shadows of unfinished monuments waiting for dawn. To him, it was not mere construction, it was resurrection. Every block of limestone, every stroke of paint, every chant of the labourers was an act of renewal, a promise to the gods that Egypt still lived in perfect balance. He often said that buildings were prayers written in stone, and so he prayed endlessly. In the temple archives, the priests began recording the pharaoh's reign, not merely in years but in achievements. The temples built, the shrines restored, the jubilees celebrated. They compared him to the gods who shaped the world at its beginning. He is Ptah, who fashions form from clay, one scribe wrote. He is Khnum, who moulds men upon the potter's wheel. He is Ra, whose light brings life to the 2 lands. Okay, Ramses encouraged such devotion not from vanity but from conviction. In his mind, to glorify the pharaoh was to glorify Egypt itself, and through Egypt, the gods. He saw no separation between mortal and divine duty. They were the same act of creation. To live was to build was to worship. And so, year after year, the monuments rose, each grander than the last. Thebes gleamed with sanctuaries, Nubia glittered with temples, Pyramses throbbed with life. Travellers from foreign lands came to marvel, their scribes returning home to speak of the god-king who carved mountains and made stone breathe. Even the Hittites, once enemies, sent gifts of craftsmen and bronze, their alliance now a bridge of artistry as much as peace. Under Ramses's hand, Egypt became a mirror of eternity, a kingdom of light and shadow, water and stone, ruled by a man who believed that by shaping the earth, he could shape the future. And as the years passed, as the monuments multiplied, and his name echoed across every corner of the Nile, the legend deepened. Ramses was no longer just pharaoh. He had become the living architect of forever. The splendor of Pyramses. The city rose from the delta like a vision out of myth. Its avenues shimmered with the reflection of the Nile. Its palaces caught the sunlight and flung it back into the heavens. Columns carved in the likeness of papyrus stalks lined the courtyards, their painted capitals gleaming in turquoise, crimson, and gold. Fragrant gardens unfolded around pools where lotus flowers drifted in silence. This was Pyramses, the house of Ramses, the new heart of empire, a city that declared to the world that Egypt's glory was eternal, and that its god-king had remade creation in his image. It was more than a capital. It was the living embodiment of Ramses's reign, the physical form of order itself. Thebes had been the seat of faith, Memphis the seat of tradition, but Pyramses was the seat of the future. Built upon the site of the old Hyksos city of Avaris, it stood near the Mediterranean trade routes, where armies could move swiftly and merchants could bring treasures from every shore. Ramses had chosen its location not by whim, but by vision. Here the empire's pulse could be felt in every beat of the river's tide. Construction had begun in the early years of his rule and continued through decades of prosperity. The city spread outward in concentric rings of splendor: palaces, temples, barracks, stables, workshops, and gardens, all bound together by wide boulevards paved with limestone slabs that glowed white beneath the sun. At its center rose the great palace complex, an expanse of courtyards and halls so vast that a traveller could walk for hours beneath its colonnades and never see the same scene twice. The palace itself was a marvel of engineering. Its walls were painted with scenes of the pharaoh's victories, its ceilings spangled with gold stars upon deep blue, imitating the night sky. Water channels fed through hidden ducts, cooling the air, while servants poured scented oil into bronze bowls that filled the corridors with the perfume of lotus and myrrh. When the pharaoh walked through these halls, attended by guards whose armor glinted like liquid fire, the courtiers prostrated themselves until their foreheads touched the floor. The sound of sandals upon stone echoed like the measured heartbeat of eternity. Outside, the palace stretched the great temple of Amun-Ra, rivaling even those of Thebes. Its pylons soared upward, their faces carved with scenes of the Battle of Kadesh and the peace that followed. Beyond it lay the temples of Ra-Horakhti, Ptah, and Set, each adorned with colossal statues of the king, their eyes forever turned toward the rising sun. The gods were not confined to heaven. They dwelled among the people, embodied in the figure of Ramses, who united them all. The population of Pyramses swelled to more than 100,000 soldiers, artisans, merchants, and priests, all living in the light of the pharaoh. The city's harbour, carved from the delta marshes, bustled with ships from across the known world. Cedarwood vessels from Byblos, copper-laden barges from Cyprus, and cargoes of incense and gold from Punt crowded its docks. The masts formed a forest of motion, the wind humming through their rigging like the voice of the gods themselves. At dawn, when the sails caught the first rays of the sun, the river seemed ablaze with molten light. Markets filled the air with colour and scent. Spices from distant lands mingled with the aroma of fresh bread baked in clay ovens. Artisans displayed jewellery of lapis and turquoise, carved amulets shaped like scarabs and falcons, linen dyed in brilliant hues. Children ran between stalls, laughing, while priests passed in solemn procession toward the temples, scattering petals along their path. Music drifted through the streets, flutes, lyres, and tambourines keeping rhythm to songs of praise for the living God who had given the city life. In the evenings, the court gathered for feasts in halls adorned with torchlight and garlands of flowers. Musicians played as dancers moved with grace and precision, their golden bracelets catching the glow of flame. Ramses presided over it all, serene and radiant, the embodiment of balance. The wine flowed like the river, laughter echoed beneath the high ceilings, and yet beneath the joy lay order, the perfect harmony of the world, under the gaze of its pharaoh. Ramses designed Pyramses not merely as a royal residence, but as a symbol of Egypt's unity. Every structure, every avenue, was aligned to cosmic principles. The temples mirrored the celestial order. The temple of Ra faced the dawn. That of Osiris faced the sunset, symbolizing life and rebirth. The city was an earthly model of the heavens, where the pharaoh's rule reflected the order of the universe itself. Even the drainage canals and irrigation systems were laid out to echo the flow of the Nile, the artery of creation. The royal stables alone were a wonder. Built to house thousands of horses, they stretched across the outskirts of the city like a separate town. Chariots of gilded wood and leather stood in endless rows, their harnesses polished daily. Ramses visited often, for he loved horses as other men loved jewels. He knew their names, their temperaments, their lineage. It was said that he spoke to them as if they were kin, and that when he rode into the field, they recognized his voice above all others. Within the heart of Pyramses, the artisan's quarter hummed with ceaseless creation. Bronze workers hammered weapons and ornaments, while sculptors shaped statues from limestone, granite, and alabaster. Painters mixed pigments in clay bowls, ochres, indigos, and greens ground from minerals drawn from the desert. The air smelled of dust and paint and sweat. They worked not for wealth, but for immortality, for to create in Ramses's service was to carve one's name into eternity. Each craftsman knew that the pharaoh himself might walk among them unannounced, inspecting the quality of their labour, offering praise or silent judgment with equal weight. And indeed, Ramses did walk among them, disguised sometimes in plain linen, accompanied by only a few attendants. He visited workshops and markets, temples and barracks. He listened to the songs of the workers, spoke with the priests, and watched the soldiers drill in the courtyards. To his people he was both distant and near, a god who could not die, yet a ruler who understood their toil. His presence, whether seen or only imagined, bound the city together. It was said that when Ramses walked through Pyramses, even the birds fell silent, and the river seemed to pause in reverence. The festivals that filled the city were unmatched in splendor. During the festival of Opet, processions wound through the streets, carrying images of the gods on golden barges adorned with silken sails. Trumpets blared, incense curled into the sky, and dancers swayed in rhythmic devotion. At the center of it all, Ramses stood upon his chariot, his crown blazing in the sunlight, his arm raised in benediction. To the people, it was not pageantry, it was the living cosmos unfolding before their eyes. As the years passed, Pyramses grew ever more magnificent. Each new decade added layers of wonder. New temples rose beside old, gardens expanded, canals deepened. The pharaoh's architects experimented with forms and proportions unseen before. The city became a gallery of evolution, a living record of the Egyptian spirit reaching ever higher toward perfection. Visitors from foreign lands returned home stunned, their tongues failing to capture the sight. One Hittite envoy described it as the city where the gods walk by day and rest by night. From his balconies overlooking the delta, Ramses often gazed across his creation at sunset. The river mirrored the colours of the sky, crimson, gold, violet, and the cry of herons echoed through the stillness. The city below shimmered in the fading light, its temples casting long shadows across the water. To the pharaoh, it was not vanity that filled his chest, but a serene certainty. He had fulfilled the charge his father had given him to restore Egypt's greatness and bind it forever to the rhythm of the divine. At times, he would think of the empires beyond Egypt's borders, the Hittites, the Babylonians, the distant lands of the Aegean. Their kings would rise and fall, their palaces crumble, their cities vanish into dust. But Pyramses, he believed, would endure. It was not merely stone and wood. It was the manifestation of Ma'at, the eternal order. As long as the sun rose, the city would breathe. He was not wrong, for in Pyramses, every part of Egypt converged. The farmers brought grain from the south. The miners sent copper and turquoise from Sinai. The scribes recorded the bounty of the land. The priests maintained the sacred rituals that kept the cosmos aligned. The city became the engine of empire, a beating heart that sent prosperity pulsing through the veins of the two lands. In the twilight of his middle years, Ramses took pride, not only in his monuments, but in the living harmony he had forged. The peace he had crafted with the Hittites had brought trade and stability. The temples he had built had united religion and state. The city he had raised had drawn the scattered peoples of Egypt into one body, one purpose, one enduring dream. And as the night fell upon the city, torches flickered along the riverfront. The scent of lotus drifted through the warm air. From the temple of Amun came the low chanting of priests greeting the stars. In the great palace, Ramses sat alone for a moment, listening to the hum of distant life, the murmur of water, the clatter of hooves, the faint sound of laughter from the gardens. It was the music of civilization, of eternity humming softly to itself. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply. Beyond the window, the horizon glowed faintly where the sun had fallen, and the first stars appeared like silver hieroglyphs upon the night. Somewhere far to the south, the temple at Abu Simbel waited for the dawn to light his stone face once more. Somewhere beyond the sands, the world whispered his name. Pyramses gleamed beneath the moon, serene and untouchable. The pharaoh had built not only a city but a statement to time itself. And though centuries would one day erase its walls and bury its avenues beneath the shifting Nile, its spirit would endure alive in the memory of a world that once looked upon it and saw perfection. For as long as the stars shone upon the river, the splendor of Pyramses would live, eternal as the sun that bore his name. The queen and the harem. Among all the glories that illuminated the reign of Ramses the Great, the temples, the victories, the cities of stone, none shone more radiantly in his heart than his queen, Nefertari. Her name, meaning the beautiful companion, carried a grace that matched her spirit, and her presence became as much a symbol of the age as the monuments that bore her husband's name. To the people of Egypt, she was not merely queen but goddess incarnate, the earthly reflection of Hathor herself, the mistress of love, music, and joy. Together, they formed the divine pair upon which the empire rested, the sun and the moon, the balance of creation and compassion. Ramses had many wives, as was the custom of pharaohs, but Nefertari held his soul. From the moment she entered his life, her intelligence, kindness, and beauty drew him like the sun draws the lotus to bloom. She was more than consort, she was counselor, poet, and priestess. Her words could temper his fury and soothe the weight of rule. In her eyes, Ramses found reflection not of power, but of peace. When she first appeared beside him in the early years of his reign, Egypt saw not just a royal partnership, but a union blessed by the gods. Together, they were depicted on temple walls, he towering in divine strength, she radiant beside him, her hand raised in offering, her gaze filled with serenity. She was granted titles no other queen had held: great royal wife, lady of grace, sweet of love, and mistress of Upper and Lower Egypt. Her name was inscribed in cartouches, a privilege reserved only for kings and gods. It was an act that elevated her beyond mortality. Ramses loved her deeply, and his devotion found form in stone. The small temple at Abu Simbel, carved beside his own colossal sanctuary, was dedicated to Nefertari and the goddess Hathor, their identities intertwined. 6 statues adorned its facade, 4 of Ramses, 2 of Nefertari, equal in height. Never before had a queen been represented as an equal to her pharaoh. Inside, the walls glowed with vibrant reliefs. Nefertari playing the sistrum before Hathor, offering flowers, walking hand in hand with her divine husband. The colours were luminous, even by torchlight blues and golds, ivory and crimson symbols of celestial harmony. The inscription above the entrance captured Ramses's devotion in words that outlived their voices: "For whom the sun shines." Within the inner sanctum, where few were ever permitted to enter, priests recited hymns comparing their love to the eternal balance of the heavens. Ramses, they said, was the blazing disk of Ra, Nefertari, the gentle glow of the moon that soothed his fire. The queen's influence extended beyond ritual. She often acted as intermediary between the pharaoh and his people, granting petitions, overseeing temple dedications, and guiding the education of royal daughters. Her correspondence with the Hittite queen Puduhepa after the peace treaty reflected her political acumen. Their letters spoke not of rivalry but of mutual respect, as women who bridged two empires with wisdom rather than war. Yet behind the splendor of devotion lay the intricate reality of court life. The royal household of Ramses was vast, an empire within the empire. His harem, or Kenneret, was a city of its own, a labyrinth of chambers, courtyards, and gardens where wives, concubines, and attendants resided. There were hundreds of women within its walls, many of noble or foreign birth, sent as offerings of alliance or tribute. They lived under strict supervision, their lives bound by ritual and hierarchy. To modern eyes, it might seem a prison gilded in gold, but in the world of Ramses, it was both sanctuary and school, a place where the women of the royal line were taught music, weaving, writing, and religion. Their purpose was not only to bear children, but to maintain the order of the household, to embody the beauty and refinement that reflected the majesty of the pharaoh. The harem had its own priests, scribes, guards, and treasurers. It functioned with the precision of a temple. Among its inhabitants were women from across the empire: Hittite princesses, Nubian nobles, Syrian daughters of tribute, all woven into the tapestry of Egypt's royal bloodline. Their arrival was not merely diplomatic, it was spiritual, for each carried the essence of her homeland, merging foreign divinities with Egypt's pantheon, expanding the empire's cosmic reach. Ramses's harem thus became a living symbol of harmony among nations, a microcosm of his realm's unity. Despite its size, one name ruled all others: Nefertari. Even as Ramses took new wives for diplomacy or lineage, the great royal wife remained the heart of the palace. Her apartments were filled with music, poetry, and the fragrance of jasmine. Servants fanned her with ostrich plumes as she composed letters or oversaw the education of her daughters. The walls of her chamber were painted with scenes of gardens and birds, and her jewellery boxes overflowed with treasures: amulets of lapis, bracelets of electrum, anklets shaped like lotus petals. But she was not a woman of vanity. Those who served her spoke of her gentleness, of how she listened to their dreams and fears, of how she greeted even the lowest servant with a smile. As the years passed, the love between Ramses and Nefertari endured like the Nile itself, changing in form, but never in strength. He would often speak of her beauty even in old age, and the poets of his court wove verses comparing her eyes to the stars over Thebes. In one surviving inscription, carved in delicate hieroglyphs upon the wall of her tomb, Ramses' devotion still breathes through the ages. My love for her is unique. No one can rival her. She is the one for whom the sun rises. To hear her voice is to live. When Nefertari fell ill, the empire held its breath. She had been the calming moon beside the blazing sun. Without her, even the light of Ramses seemed to dim. He summoned the finest physicians and priests to Thebes, filling the air with prayers and incense, yet not even a god-king could command time. One quiet evening, as the lotus flowers closed upon the river and the stars appeared above the Valley of the Queens, the beautiful companion slipped beyond the veil. The loss struck Ramses with a sorrow deeper than any wound of war. For days he secluded himself, refusing counsel or comfort. The temples echoed with mourning hymns. The people wept in the streets. When he finally emerged, his face was solemn but serene. He ordered the construction of a tomb worthy of her soul, a masterpiece that would rival his own temples in splendor. Her tomb, QV 66, became the jewel of the Valley of the Queens. Its walls glowed with color as vivid as sunrise. On one, Nefertari stands before the gods, radiant and calm, her gown white as starlight. On another, she plays Senet, the game of the afterlife, with her own spirit as opponent, a serene contest between body and eternity. The ceilings were painted deep blue, scattered with golden stars, as if she slept beneath the night sky forever. Ramses spared no labor, no treasure. He poured his grief into art, transforming love into immortality. In the temple of Abu Simbel, the light of the solstice still falls upon his statue twice a year, but in the smaller temple beside it, dedicated to her, the light of every dawn belongs to Nefertari. Even centuries after her passing, travellers who entered her tomb felt the warmth of devotion etched into every wall. Time had faded the pigments, yet not the love. After her death, Ramses continued to rule with strength and grace, but those who knew him said that something in him had quieted. He turned more often to his children, to the work of governance, to the stillness of creation. The harem continued to flourish. New queens took titles. New alliances were forged, yet none replaced the beautiful companion. Her memory lived in the rhythm of his reign. When the festivals of Hathor were held, her statues were carried beside his. When the temple musicians played, they sang her name in soft hymns that mingled with the wind. In the hall of the palace, a painting hung of her serene face, eyes half closed, lips curved in peace. Every morning, as the pharaoh began his duties, he paused before it in silence, as if drawing strength from the image of the woman for whom the sun had once risen. And so, amid the vastness of his works and the chorus of his victories, Ramses remained, at heart, a man who had loved deeply and lost profoundly. The empire remembered him as god and conqueror. But in the quiet chambers of eternity, the heart of Ramses the Great beat still for his queen. In the golden age of Egypt's peace and splendor, the story of Ramses and Nefertari became more than royal romance. It became myth itself. It was the eternal union of sun and moon, of power and grace, of life and love, carved forever into stone and memory. Sons of the sun, as Egypt flourished beneath the reign of Ramses the Great, the royal palaces overflowed with the laughter and footsteps of his children. They were countless, the living stars orbiting the sun of their father's glory. By the time the pharaoh reached the middle years of his reign, his offspring numbered in the hundreds, sons and daughters born of queens, princesses, and foreign consorts. Some whispered that the palace held more heirs than soldiers, and though such words were exaggeration, the truth was close enough to awe the empire. Ramses's household was not only vast, it was a reflection of his immortality. Each child carried his blood, his name, his divine spark. They were the continuation of a god made flesh. Yet among this multitude, order reigned. Egypt was no stranger to the complexities of inheritance, and Ramses, wise in governance, ensured that his legacy would not crumble into chaos. At the center of the royal hierarchy stood his beloved firstborn by Nefertari, Prince Amun, her Khepeshef. Amun is with his strong arm. The boy was born in glory and raised in expectation. From his earliest days, he followed his father through the courts and camps, learning not only the language of power, but the weight of it. He was tall and proud, with the bearing of a warrior and the calm of a scholar. Ramses saw in him a reflection of his own youth, and the father's pride in the son was plain to all who beheld them together. When the pharaoh rode through the city in his chariot, Amun her Khepeshef rode beside him, his bow at the ready, his golden armour gleaming. He was taught the art of command, the strategies of battle, and the rituals of kingship. Scribes instructed him in the sacred scripts. Priests guided him in the mysteries of the gods. At night, when the torches burned low, Ramses would speak to his heir in the stillness of the palace gardens. "Remember, my son," he would say, "the crown is not a gift. It is a burden shaped by the hands of the people and the will of the gods. To rule is to serve eternity." The prince listened with reverence, his young eyes reflecting the firelight, and he vowed to uphold the legacy that shone before him. Around Amun, her Khepeshef gathered his brothers, men of courage and ambition, trained in the arts of war and faith. They were captains, priests, governors, and ambassadors, each representing a facet of the pharaoh's boundless will. Their names filled the records like a litany: Ramses, Kamwaset, Meneptah, Perherwenemef, Meriatum, and many more, each born under stars of destiny. Of them, one stood apart, not for battle, but for wisdom. Prince Waset, the fourth son, whose heart leaned not toward conquest, but toward memory. Where others sought to build, he sought to preserve. As high priest of Ptah in Memphis, he became guardian of Egypt's heritage, restoring ancient temples and tombs that had long crumbled to sand. His love for the past was as deep as his father's vision for the future. He ordered inscriptions carved to record the names of forgotten kings, ensuring that no ruler, however small, would vanish from history. In later centuries, Egyptians would call him the first archaeologist, a man who saved what time sought to erase. Ramses cherished him deeply, for in Waset he saw a mirror of his own reverence for eternity. The pharaoh built for the ages, his son guarded those ages from oblivion. Between them, creation and remembrance intertwined like the twin banks of the Nile. Ramses's daughters, too, were children of both beauty and intellect. Among them were Bintenath, Meritamun, Nebetawi, and Henutmaya women, who embodied the grace of their mother and the divine authority of their father. They served as priestesses in the temples of Thebes and Memphis, dancing in sacred rituals, leading hymns, and tending the altars of Hathor and Isis. Some became royal wives to their own father, as tradition sometimes demanded, preserving the divine bloodline and symbolizing the union of heaven and earth. To the people, this was not scandal, but sanctity, the eternal cycle of rebirth, where the sun fathered the stars that shone around him. In the royal palace of Ramses, daily life unfolded with ceremony and rhythm. Tutors instructed the princes in reading, writing, and the sacred language of hieroglyphs. They studied law, mathematics, and astronomy, the courses of stars and floods that shaped their land. The younger children played in the courtyards, their laughter echoing between the colonnades. Nurses watched over them, servants carried trays of fruit and milk, and guards in shining helmets stood sentinel at every gate. Ramses moved among them as both father and deity. When he appeared in the courtyard, conversation ceased. Every child knelt in reverence. Yet he was not distant. He would lift the smallest into his arms, speak gently to the timid, and smile upon those who dared to meet his gaze. To them, he was more than Pharaoh. He was the sun itself, the source of warmth and life. The palace chroniclers recorded these moments with reverence, describing how the king's presence filled every corner with light. Beyond the palace walls, the princes carried their father's name into the world. They commanded garrisons in Canaan, supervised temple works in Thebes, and served as emissaries to allied lands. Wherever they went, the image of Ramses went with them, his lineage a living banner of power. The sons of the sun were Egypt's promise to the future, ensuring that the pharaoh's radiance would not fade when his body returned to the stars. But even divine dynasties are not spared the tragedies of time. The years, which had once stretched endlessly before Ramses, began to take their toll upon his house. His beloved firstborn, Amun-Her-Khepeshef, fell ill and died before his father, struck down by an unseen sickness that no prayer could cure. The funeral procession wound through Thebes in mournful splendor, priests chanting, incense rising, the air thick with sorrow. The pharaoh followed in silence, his face a mask of dignity, but behind his eyes burned grief deeper than any wound of war. In the tomb of his son, Ramses ordered walls painted with scenes of eternal youth, the prince riding his chariot beside the sun, forever triumphant. "He is with the gods now," Ramses told his people, though in private, the loss hollowed him. The ruler who had faced armies and gods alike now bowed to the inevitability of death. The passing of his heir was the first whisper of his own mortality, yet the wheel of dynasty turned on. After Amun-Her-Khepeshef came Waset, then Merneptah, each rising to the title of crown prince as the years carried them forward. Ramses watched them grow into men of stature and strength. He took pride in their loyalty, their discipline, their reverence. They accompanied him to jubilees, military inspections, and temple dedications, their faces solemn beside his. To the people, it seemed that the pharaoh had become eternal, his line unbroken, his power infinite. As age advanced, Ramses began to look upon his sons and daughters not merely as heirs, but as fragments of himself scattered across the empire. He saw in each one a different aspect of his being: bravery, wisdom, compassion, ambition. Through them, his essence multiplied. Each time a son led a campaign, each time a daughter raised an offering to the gods, the pharaoh's spirit expanded beyond his own flesh. In them, he found continuity beyond death. When the royal family gathered for festivals at Pyramses, the sight was overwhelming: a sea of linen and gold, of faces bearing the same sharp eyes, the same confident grace. Hundreds knelt before the pharaoh as musicians played, and the people watched in awe. To see Ramses surrounded by his progeny was to glimpse eternity given human form. The scribes called it the circle of the sun, for his descendants radiated from him like rays of light. Ramses's affection for his children was genuine and enduring. He visited their homes, celebrated their births, blessed their marriages, yet he was also pharaoh, immovable, divine, and bound by the laws of Ma'at. When disputes arose within the royal court, he judged them with fairness, reminding his sons that no one, not even blood, stood above order. "The kingdom is not mine alone," he told them. "It belongs to truth itself. I am only its guardian." His children listened, kneeling before him as subjects before their God. They understood that the throne, though wrapped in love, was a mountain few could climb. As the decades passed, one by one, his sons preceded him into the afterlife. Their tombs filled the Valley of the Kings like constellations, each bearing the names of those who had once carried his banner. The griefs were many, yet Ramses endured. He was the eternal flame. His children were sparks that returned to the divine fire. When finally, near the end of his reign, the last of his elder sons was gone, he appointed Meneptah, the 13th son, as heir. By then, Ramses was old, his skin creased like worn papyrus, yet his eyes still burned with the same golden light that had carried him through wars and triumphs. He looked upon Meneptah and saw the final extension of his will. "You are the last dawn of my day," he said softly, "but the sun never sets, it only changes its sky." And so the dynasty continued. The sons of the sun, the daughters of the moon, and the pharaoh who had given them life stood as living testimony to the endurance of Egypt's soul. Through them, Ramses conquered what no army could time itself: God among men. By the middle decades of his reign, Ramses no longer seemed merely a king moving through the corridors of his palaces. He appeared to his people as a force of nature, as constant and as unquestioned as the rising of the sun over the Nile. The lines at the corners of his eyes had deepened. The bronze of his skin had weathered under decades of desert light. Yet the aura around him only grew. Time, which bent all bodies toward dust, appeared to circle him rather than strike. To those who lived beneath his rule, he was not simply pharaoh. He had become the living axis of the world. The theology of Egypt had long prepared the way for such a transformation. From the earliest dynasties, the king had been regarded as Horus on earth, son of Ra, bridge between mankind and the gods. In temple texts and ritual, the pharaoh did not serve the gods as a distant worshipper. He participated in their councils, stood in their presence, and received their power as his rightful inheritance. Under Ramses, this ancient idea took on an intensity never before realized. As his monuments multiplied and his image filled every sanctuary, the distinction between deity and sovereign slowly dissolved. Priests at Karnak and Luxor spoke of him as if he were already among the imperishable stars. Reliefs carved on temple walls showed him the same size as the great gods, his figure striding beside Amun, Ra, and Ptah in scenes of cosmic creation. In some, he even appeared offering life to other deities, a privilege once reserved solely for them to bestow. Each depiction carried a silent message that the people absorbed with every festival and every procession. The gods animated the universe, and Ramses animated Egypt. Without him, the chain of order would shatter. His jubilees, the said festivals, expressed this transformation in formal ritual, traditionally held after 30 years on the throne and renewed at intervals thereafter. They were ceremonies of royal rebirth. When the time arrived for Ramses's first said festival, Egypt had already lived under his guidance for decades of prosperity and peace. The land had never known such enduring stability in living memory. As preparations began, workers cleared processional routes, priests rehearsed ancient liturgies, and artisans fashioned regalia of dazzling complexity. On the appointed days, the celebrations swept across the two lands like a tide. In Thebes, Memphis, and Pyramses, people thronged the streets, their bodies painted with festival pigment, their arms heavy with garlands. At the heart of it all, in carefully orchestrated sequence, the pharaoh enacted the drama of divine renewal. He appeared in ceremonial courtyards, clad in white robes, wearing first one crown, then another, running symbolically between boundary markers to demonstrate that his strength had not diminished with age. The priests observed every movement with solemn concentration. Each gesture affirmed that the contract between king and cosmos still held firm. When the ceremonies concluded, the official record proclaimed that Ramses had been spiritually rejuvenated, his authority refreshed by the approval of the gods. For the common people watching from afar, the effect was profound. They saw an aging ruler step into the prescribed patterns of myth and emerge renewed, as if time itself had acknowledged his endurance and stepped aside. In the years that followed, additional jubilees reinforced this impression. While other kings in earlier ages had ruled briefly and faded, Ramses seemed to stretch beyond the normal span of human expectation. Children who had once watched his triumphal processions from their father's shoulders grew old in his service. Their grandchildren spoke his name as something permanent, a fixture of the world like the flood or the stars. To them, he was not a transient figure at the apex of a fragile hierarchy. He was the center of existence. This perception was not accidental. Ramses and the priesthood understood the power of ritual and image. In every major temple, chapels were dedicated to his cult. Statues of him were consecrated and treated not merely as representations but as living presences. Priests washed these statues in sacred water, clothed them in fine linen, placed food offerings before them, and recited hymns that praised him with the same language once reserved for the gods of the Ennead. Incense rose before his sculpted features just as it did before images of Amun or Ra. In some shrines, his birth and enthronement were depicted as events orchestrated directly by the gods themselves. Reliefs showed divine arms extending crowns toward his brow, celestial hieroglyphs proclaiming that his heart was already known to heaven before he drew breath. These visual narratives merged biography with myth until it was impossible to separate the human child of Seti from the eternal figure designed by the cosmos. The effect of this on everyday life was subtle yet pervasive. Farmers labouring along the irrigation ditches spoke his name in blessings when the water flowed smoothly. Sailors on the Mediterranean invoked him as protector when storms threatened. Soldiers at remote outposts, scanning the horizon for distant raiders, took comfort in the idea that Ramses's gaze reached even there. In marketplaces, storytellers recounted episodes of his bravery and generosity, blending history with legend until each became indistinguishable from the other. The people did not analyze these tales. They breathed them. Foreigners, too, felt the gravity of his persona. When envoys from Hatti, Babylon, and distant lands arrived at Pyramses, they entered not only a court of political negotiation, but a sphere of palpable sacredness. The approach to the audience hall was a carefully constructed progression of awe. First came the outer courtyards, busy with scribes, guards, and heralds. Then the inner halls, lined with columns, each surface inscribed with scenes of victory and cosmic order. At last, beyond incense, haze, and polished floors, the throne itself rose upon a platform, guarded by statues of lions and falcons. On that throne sat Ramses, framed by painted wings and carved sun discs. His posture was perfectly still, his face composed in an expression that blended serenity with unspoken authority. The envoys saw not a weary elder, but a figure indistinguishable from the colossal statues that towered outside. Age had added depth to his features, but the aura of command remained unbroken. When they approached to present their gifts and messages, they adjusted their gestures with care, for the atmosphere around him made casual behavior impossible. Their letters addressed him as Great King. Their bowed heads acknowledged something more. This divine kingship extended beyond public ceremony into the written record. Official inscriptions referred to him with layers of exalted titles that emphasized his superhuman nature. In one set of texts, he is described as the bull powerful in strength, the lord of radiance, the one whose years are countless. Elsewhere, he is likened to the everlasting sky, to the mountain that cannot be shaken, to the sun disk whose light nourishes all things. Such metaphors were not ornamental phrases to his scribes. They were statements of cosmic fact. Even within the royal family, his status as more than mortal-shaped relationships. His sons, though princes of high rank and commanders in their own right, approached him with the reverence due to a god. His daughters, serving as priestesses in various temples, honored him in hymns and rituals. In domestic spaces, affectionate memory of him blurred with reverential awe. Generations grew up knowing him not only as father or grandfather, but as the living embodiment of Ma'at, the sacred balance that kept the world from descending into chaos. Temples dedicated to his cult formed an invisible network of presence from one end of the country to the other. At sunrise, priests in Nubia lit lamps and recited prayers in his name. At midday, offerings were placed before his statues in Thebes, Memphis, and the Delta. At night, as stars brightened over the desert, smaller shrines in village chapels kept vigil, with oil lamps flickering before his carved likeness. These rituals did not detract from worship of the older gods. Rather, they flowed alongside, fusing the identity of the monarch with the very framework of the divine. Over time, Ramses's divinity became woven into the geography of memory. Travelers sailing upstream passed temple after temple bearing his image. Each facade, each pylon, each colossal statue reinforced a single message. This life was not ordinary, this reign not transient. The stones themselves seemed to speak of continuity. Where the river curved, one of his sanctuaries might appear perched above the bank, its columns catching the light. Where cliffs rose, his sculpted face stared out from their flanks. Even the desert, usually indifferent to human ambition, seemed to have accepted his claim upon it. In the houses of scribes and priests, papyrus scrolls recorded oracles that affirmed his divine favor. When questions of national importance arose, statues of the gods were carried in processions, and their movements interpreted as answers. Again and again, these signs were read as endorsements of his policies and decisions. The people heard of such oracles and understood that the gods themselves had examined their king and continued to approve. As the decades lengthened, an entire generation knew no other ruler. A child born in the early years of his reign could grow, marry, raise children, and reach old age while Ramses still sat upon the throne. This experience altered the very way time was felt in Egypt. Instead of dynasties rising and falling with unsettling speed, there was one unbroken line of continuity, one luminous presence that had presided over every harvest and every flood for as long as anyone could recall. In that unusual stretch of stability, the idea of Ramses as a god among men seemed not only plausible, but inevitable. People did not ask whether a human being could truly be divine. They lived inside a reality where that divinity shaped every day. The sound of temple drums at dawn, the sight of his cartouches on granary walls, the stories told at night under oil lamps all reinforced the same understanding. The king was not distant myth. He was the living center of existence, felt in every corner of the land. Beyond Egypt's borders, his reputation took on similar hues. Traders from foreign lands returned home, describing not just wealth and monuments, but a ruler whose reign seemed to stand outside the normal span of years. In distant courts, kings who had once measured themselves against him began instead to reckon with his constancy as a fixed fact of the age. Clay tablets bearing his name circulated in archives far from the Nile, their cuneiform signs preserving agreements, marriages, and alliances that all assumed his enduring presence. Within Egypt itself, even natural events were interpreted through the lens of his perceived divinity. A particularly generous flood became a sign that the gods favored his rule. A successful harvest confirmed that his alignment with Ma'at remained intact. When plagues or misfortunes struck neighboring regions, Egyptians contrasted their own relative stability with the turmoil elsewhere and concluded that their king's bond with the divine still held strong. The rhythm of seasons merged with the rhythm of his long life until the two felt inseparable. And somewhere within that vast edifice of worship and ritual, an aging man moved through his routines with measured dignity. Ramses rose each morning, bathed, donned his regalia, accepted reports from his officials, reviewed building projects, met with priests and scribes, and presided over ceremonies. His joints may have stiffened, his steps may have slowed, yet his resolve did not waver. He had long since accepted that his own individuality had been absorbed into something larger. The persona of Ramses the Great, God among men, was no longer solely his to command. It belonged now to Egypt, to the temples, to the stories carried on the river wind. He understood this, and in that understanding there was a certain stillness. The monuments, the rituals, the endless repetition of his name, all served a purpose beyond personal glory. They upheld the order of the world as he had come to know it. As long as the people believed, as long as the priests performed their duties, as long as the Nile continued its eternal cycle, the light he represented would not fail. So, the years continued. Calendar after calendar was completed, festival after festival celebrated, offerings after offerings placed before images that bore his face. The gods of Egypt still received their share, but beside them, and sometimes above them, stood the figure of Ramses, carved in stone and carried in memory, a man who had allowed himself to become the vessel of something boundless. In that long twilight of his reign, Egypt moved through its days within a world that seemed fixed and unshakable. The land did not yet sense that empires could decline, that monuments could crumble, that rivers could shift their course. Under the gaze of Ramses the Great, everything felt permanent. The people worked, prayed, and dreamed inside, a reality shaped by a single, towering life, a life that, to them, had crossed the threshold between human limitation and sacred eternity. Shadows beyond the frontier, the empire of Egypt, radiant under Ramses's long and steady light, began to show the faintest hairline fractures at its edges. They were invisible at first, hidden beneath the gleam of prosperity, the roar of festivals, the endless pulse of the Nile that made each harvest abundant. But the balance that sustained the two lands' mat itself was delicate, and even the smallest disturbance at the borders could ripple like a wave through the heart of the kingdom. To the common people, all still seemed golden. The markets of Pyramses overflowed with copper, grain, and incense. Temples gleamed with fresh paint and new offerings. Songs of praise to the living God filled the air, from Thebes to Memphis. Yet beyond the horizon of ordinary sight, where the desert melted into foreign hills and sea routes curved toward distant shores, change was stirring, slow, inevitable, and beyond the reach of even a pharaoh's command. The peace forged with the Hittites held firm, its parchment hardened by time into tradition. Envoys still travelled between the two empires, bearing gifts of silver and words of friendship. Hittite princesses still resided in Egypt's palaces, their children growing beneath the same sun as the pharaoh's own. But in the north, new powers were awakening. The kingdoms of the Aegean and the Anatolian coasts, the Mycenaeans, the Lucca, the mysterious peoples of the sea had begun to move, raiding and migrating with hunger that knew no border. The tides of commerce that once carried cedar and tin now bore rumours of fleets and fire. To the west, the Libyan tribes grew restless. For generations, they had lingered at Egypt's frontier traders, herdsmen, mercenaries, but the steady growth of population and the decline of grazing lands pushed them inward. They came first in small groups, then in waves, testing the vigilance of garrisons stationed along the western delta. Their attacks were scattered and small, but their persistence was the warning of a larger storm. Ramses, always the soldier even in age, ordered new fortifications built along the frontier. Watchtowers rose over the dunes, and patrols traced the edges of the empire. He understood what few rulers did. The greatest danger to an empire was not a single enemy, but exhaustion, the slow fraying of attention after years of peace. Egypt's wealth, immense though it was, depended on endless coordination. The irrigation canals of the delta required constant repair. The temples demanded offerings and labour. The armies required pay and provisions. The machinery of eternity was vast, and it consumed as much as it produced. As the pharaoh aged into his 60s and 70s, the burden of maintenance fell increasingly to his administrators and sons. Some served faithfully, others sought their own advantage. Even under the calm surface of divinity, politics simmered like the hidden current beneath the Nile's placid face. Priests grew powerful in Thebes, their temples swelling with wealth. The cult of Amun, always mighty, now rivaled even the throne in influence. Offerings meant for the state found their way into temple granaries. Lands, once taxed by the crown, became property of the gods. Yet Ramses, too wise and too old for open conflict, managed the balance with steady hand and careful speech. He visited the temples often, presenting himself as both servant and equal to the gods, reaffirming that their prosperity was bound to his. The priests, flattered and cautious, responded with hymns and loyalty, at least in public. Still, the empire's centre remained solid. The Nile floods came as they always had, and the people believed their king's favour ensured it. But further afield, the winds of the world were shifting. Trade caravans from the north reported strange movements. Cities burned, ports abandoned, ships appearing on foreign coasts and vanishing again into the mist. The sea peoples, as later generations would call them, were gathering in strength, though they would not reach Egypt's shores until after Ramses's death. The tremors of their coming already stirred the air. Ramses, though godlike in the eyes of his people, could sense the pulse of decline before others did. In private, within the cool silence of his palaces, he sometimes spoke softly to his most trusted advisers. "The world changes as the flood changes its course," he once said, gazing out toward the delta, where the waters shimmered. "The wise man builds the dikes high before the waters rise." And so he continued to build, not merely in stone, but in systems of order. He ensured the succession of his sons, strengthened provincial governors, and renewed alliances with Nubia and Libya. His long reign had taught him that eternity required constant tending. No monument, however grand, was immune to time. No empire, however divine, was exempt from the cycle of birth, growth, and decay. He had seen once great cities fade beneath the desert, their names forgotten, their kings unremembered. That knowledge gave his works urgency, not despair. He built because he knew everything perished. Still, he could not escape the subtle signs of the empire's fatigue. Grain shipments arrived slower, taxes lighter. Reports from the far south spoke of raids by Nubian tribes seeking revenge for old grievances. The once loyal vassal cities of Canaan grew independent, emboldened by the distance of their aging overlord. Egypt's dominion over the Levant, so proudly claimed in the reliefs of Kadesh, now lived more in stone than in truth. Yet within the temples and the hearts of the people, the myth endured. The pharaoh's image carved in every shrine still proclaimed mastery over the world. And that image itself held power. Ramses was too seasoned to rage against the inevitable. Instead, he embraced the illusion as part of the order he had created. If men believe in the sun, he told his scribes, then the sun still shines. So he continued to hold jubilees, to commission temples, to bless the harvests with his presence. The grand machinery of worship and ceremony kept the people's faith alive, and faith, he knew, was the true foundation of any empire. He visited Thebes once more in his later years. The city had changed little in his long reign. The temples of Karnak and Luxor still gleamed. The processions still filled the streets with music. Yet to Ramses, everything seemed quieter, slower. The Nile glimmered as always, but the banks where he had once marched in youth now bore trees that had grown thick in his time, shading the paths of those who would one day forget his face. Standing beneath the colossal pylons of his own temple, he traced the hieroglyphs that told of battles won half a century earlier. The carvings were crisp, but the memories had softened into legend. What had once been thunder was now ritual. He smiled faintly, not in bitterness, but in understanding. He ordered restorations where age had worn the stone, instructed the priests to repaint the colours that time had dulled. The gods must never fade, he said simply. In truth, he spoke of himself. He was the living God who had endured longer than any before him, but he knew that endurance could not prevent the slow encroachment of shadow. Even divine light stretches long and thin before dusk. At Pyramses, the capital still glittered, but beneath its beauty the river channels began to silt. Each year the Nile shifted slightly, withdrawing from the city's docks. Engineers dredged and diverted, but the slow migration was unstoppable. The city that had once been the heart of empire was slowly, imperceptibly, turning into an inland island. The pharaoh's dream of eternal Pyramses was being undermined by the same river that had given it life. Still, Ramses refused to abandon it. He moved through its halls as if the golden age had not dimmed. Festivals continued, scribes recorded victories long past, and temples resounded with hymns proclaiming his vigour. For the people, time had no meaning as long as he lived. To them, Egypt was as eternal as its king. At night, however, the old pharaoh sometimes sat alone upon his balcony, the sounds of the city faint below. The stars wheeled slowly above him, indifferent and ancient. He watched them and felt the enormity of the span he had lived, the years piled behind him like the walls of a temple stretching into shadow. He thought of Seti, of Nefertari, of the sons who had gone before him. Their names he had inscribed in tombs, their faces carved beside his own, yet their voices were gone. Only the rustle of wind through the palm leaves answered him. He had ruled longer than any mortal remembered. He had raised monuments that pierced the heavens. Yet in that quiet, he understood what the priests never spoke aloud. Even eternity has its dusk. The stones would outlive him, the hymns would continue for a time, but the flood of history would one day wash over all. He did not fear it. To have ruled for so long, to have built so much, to have given shape to the dreams of millions, this was victory enough. And so, as the empire's edges trembled and the outer world shifted, Ramses remained unmoved. The storms would come, the sands would rise, but Egypt, in his mind, would endure as long as the sun rose each morning. He had given it form, breath, and memory. What happened beyond its borders was for lesser men to fear. He turned his gaze eastward, where the first pale light of dawn broke across the horizon. The same sun that had crowned him decades ago still climbed from the desert, gold and silent. Its reflection rippled across the river, and for a moment the waters seemed to carry back his youth, the flash of bronze armour, the gleam of banners, the music of triumph, Then the vision faded into the calm of morning. The old king smiled, faintly and knowingly. The frontier might darken, the world might change, but the light, his light, had already filled it. The final years of the God King, the sun of Egypt, had not set in nearly 7 decades. When Ramses the Great entered the twilight of his reign, he had outlived not only his enemies and rivals, but nearly all of those who had stood beside him in the vigour of youth. Generations had been born, flourished, and gone to their rest while he continued, serene and unwavering, upon the throne of Ra. To the people, it no longer seemed that a man reigned, but that a principle ruled a law of nature, as constant as the turning of the river and the seasons. He was well past 90, his hair turned white beneath the golden crown, his frame leaner but still straight. His eyes, though clouded by age, retained that steady flame that had once burned on battlefields and in the shadowed chambers of state. His voice, deep and measured, carried through the courts with the same weight as ever. The courtiers bowed, not merely in obedience but in awe. They had never known another pharaoh. He had become time itself. His face had been carved in stone thousands of times, and yet in his final years, the real face, the living, breathing man, was softer, human, lined with the depth of memory. But even those wrinkles seemed divine. The priests called them the marks of Ra, signs that the sun had lived many days upon earth. Ramses rose at dawn as he always had. The royal attendants washed him in perfumed water, anointed his limbs with oil, and dressed him in linen so fine it was almost translucent. He still presided over councils, still received emissaries, still signed decrees with his own hand. Yet more often now, his speech turned toward reflection. He would pause between audiences, gaze upon the carved reliefs of his own victories, and speak softly to those near him. "All that a man makes is a shadow of what he dreams," he would murmur, "but shadows, too, preserve the shape of light." His sons and grandsons moved quietly through the halls, careful not to disturb the rhythm of eternity that surrounded him. Merneptah, now an old man himself, served as heir and co-regent, executing affairs of state, while his father remained the spiritual pillar of the realm. There was no conflict between them. Ramses had long ago shaped his house into harmony. He had seen too many dynasties fall to vanity and ambition. His family revered him not only as patriarch but as god, and that reverence maintained the peace. The kingdom still thrived. The granaries were full, the temples sang his name, and the Nile, obedient as ever, brought fertility to the land. To the ordinary people, the pharaoh's reign was a golden age beyond imagining. They could not conceive of its end. It was a story that had gone on too long to think it could close. But the sands of the hourglass, though slow, were still falling. The temples of Pyramses still gleamed, but the shifting channels of the Nile had drawn the river farther away. Canals were dug to feed the docks, but the lifeblood of the city was receding. The pharaoh knew that one day the capital would be abandoned, its splendor fading into reeds and mud, yet he never lamented it. "Cities move as men do," he once said. "They must return to the sand from which they rose, for the sand is patient." He spent more and more time in quiet devotion. Within the courtyards of the Ramesseum, he walked among the statues of himself, enormous figures that dwarfed the man they represented. Their gazes were fixed eternally eastward, to the sunrise, while he, frail but unbroken, stood at their feet, looking up. He did not see vanity there, he saw continuity. "They will remember," he whispered, running his hand along the cool stone. "The shape of the sun remains, even when the sun itself has passed beyond the horizon." Each year, he celebrated another jubilee, the festivals of renewal that proclaimed him eternally young. The priests no longer ran with him between the markers as they once had. The rituals were shortened, symbolic, yet the people still gathered by the tens of thousands. The processions flowed through the avenues, drums thundered, and golden banners caught the light. The pharaoh appeared upon his throne, radiant in white, his face calm as eternity itself. The crowd erupted with cries of devotion, tears streaming down their cheeks. They had never seen the Nile without his shadow upon it, and they could not imagine that they ever would. In the solitude of his chambers, Ramses sometimes felt the distance of those who had gone before. His father Seti, his mother Tuya, his queen Nefertari, all were long gone, their tombs sealed and silent. He had outlived nearly every son and daughter, save Meneptah. The palace, though filled with descendants, often seemed to him an echoing hall of ghosts. Yet he did not grieve as ordinary men grieved. He believed that time was a cycle, not a wall, and that each soul he had loved had merely crossed to the far side of the same river that still flowed beside his window. When the wind rose from the west, carrying the scent of the desert, he would close his eyes and imagine he heard their voices, the laughter of Nefertari, the proud tones of Amun-Herkhepeshef, the measured wisdom of Khem-Waset. The sound comforted him. In his mind, death was not departure, but transformation, the next phase of divine duty. On certain nights, when the moon glowed silver over the river, he ordered no torches lit. He would stand on the balcony and watch the reflection of the stars ripple upon the water. How many nights have I seen this same sky, he thought. And yet it never tires. The sky was the only mirror that matched his endurance. The scribes recorded that even in his final decade, Ramses continued to oversee the maintenance of temples, the repair of canals, the dispatching of troops to guard distant borders. His mind remained sharp. He could recall the smallest details of his earliest campaigns, the names of commanders long dead, the positions of hills outside Kadesh. Yet he spoke of them not as boasts, but as memories belonging to another lifetime, to another self. That young man, he once said with faint amusement, believed the world could be shaped by strength alone, but even stone yields more easily to patience. He had become a philosopher without writing a word, a sage whose wisdom was carved not in papyrus, but in the order he had built. His empire was his scripture, his monuments its verses. As he entered his 90s, the strain of years finally began to press upon him. His steps grew slow, his appetite less. The physicians brought him mixtures of honey and figs, incense and oils, herbs from distant lands. None of it could hold back the soft encroachment of twilight. Yet he greeted it not with fear but with serenity. The sun must set to rise again, he told the high priest of Amun. Even Ra sails through the darkness before returning to the dawn. In the final year of his life, he made one last journey up the Nile. The voyage was slow and solemn, a farewell more than a triumph. The river he had crossed in his youth was unchanged, the same shimmering path through reeds and temples, the same scent of silt and lotus, but everything upon its banks bore his mark. He saw children playing in the shadow of statues that bore his name, farmers harvesting grain from fields his engineers had irrigated, priests chanting before temples he had raised. He had become the landscape itself. When his barge reached Thebes, he disembarked with help from his attendants. The people fell to their knees, weeping, for even in frailty his presence radiated peace. He visited the Ramesseum one final time. The priests awaited him with incense and hymns, their voices trembling. The old king stood before the colossal doorway, his figure dwarfed by his own creation. He lifted his hand in benediction. "May Egypt endure as long as these stones," he said softly. He returned to Pyramses soon after. There, surrounded by his descendants and priests, he spent his last days in quiet contemplation. On the morning of his death, the palace was utterly still. The river outside glimmered like molten glass. As the sun rose, a single ray of light entered his chamber, striking the golden amulet of Ra that rested upon his chest. Those who attended him said he smiled faintly, as though seeing something just beyond their sight. Then his breath ceased, calm as the ebbing tide. He had lived to nearly 96 years, the longest reign any pharaoh had ever known. The god who had walked as man was gone. Across Egypt, wailing filled the air. Priests tore their garments, and the temples thundered with lamentation. Yet amid the mourning, there was awe. None could remember the world before him. For some, it felt as though the sun itself had gone dark. They embalmed him with all the rites due a god. His body, wrapped in linen and resin, was adorned with jewels and placed within nested coffins of gilded wood. Spells from the Book of the Dead were recited to guide his spirit through the duet. At Thebes, deep within the Valley of the Kings, they laid him to rest in a tomb whose corridors glowed with painted light. Upon its walls, Ramses greeted the gods as an equal, passing through the hours of night toward eternal morning. Outside, the priests sealed the door, and the desert wind swept across the valley. The living returned to their temples, their homes, their endless tasks beneath the returning sun. And though the man was gone, his presence lingered everywhere in the hum of the river, the chant of the priests, the towering silhouettes that watched over the sands. Egypt breathed in his rhythm still, the mortal immortal. The death of Ramses the Great did not end his reign, it merely transformed it. The tomb was sealed, the funerary rites complete, yet the presence of the pharaoh lingered through every corridor of the two lands. The priests of Amun said that his Ka, the vital essence, had ascended to join Ra upon his solar bark, sailing the heavens by day and conquering the darkness by night. The people believed it absolutely. For decades after his passing, they continued to speak his name in the present tense. "The Great One protects us," they said. "The son of Ramses still shines. No ruler in memory had lived so long, nor cast so immense a shadow." His death, when it came, was a moment the nation could scarcely comprehend. Men and women who had been born, grown old, and buried their children had never known another pharaoh. The very thought of life without him seemed unnatural, like a day without dawn. But even as his body was carried into eternity, his works remained the colossal temples, the cities of stone, the obelisks that pierced the sky. Egypt itself seemed built in his image. In the weeks following his funeral, the land fell under a hush. The jubilation of daily life, the markets, the festivals, the chants of harvest faded into quiet reverence. The royal family withdrew to Thebes. Merneptah, the 13th son and chosen heir, ascended the throne, his brow heavy with both crown and sorrow. His father's hand still seemed to rest upon the world. Every decision he made, every word he spoke, was measured against the memory of the god who had ruled before him. The priests ensured that the transition was one of divine continuity. In every major temple, rituals were performed to unite Ramses' spirit with the eternal gods. His statues were dressed in white linen and perfumed oils, their eyes lined with fresh paint to see the world anew. At dawn, the high priest of Amun proclaimed from the temple gates, "The sun has not set, it has only passed to the horizon." In Pyramses, the great capital that bore his name, the atmosphere was unlike anything the people had known. The wide avenues still shone with marble, but an invisible stillness hung in the air. The city he had built with such purpose now felt like a vast memory, a monument to a life larger than the sum of its stones. The river still flowed through its channels, but its waters reflected an emptier sky. Yet Ramses's image endured. Everywhere his likeness stood, people gathered with offerings of bread, flowers, and wine. They bowed before the statues as if the living king still sat enthroned within. To them, he had not died. He had crossed into the divine state he had long embodied. "The living Horus has become the Osiris," they whispered, for such was the fate of kings. The human form yielded to the eternal. In the Valley of the Kings, where his tomb wound deep into the rock, his priests kept vigil for 70 days. They recited prayers from the Amduat, describing his journey through the 12 hours of night. In those painted passages, Ramses's spirit met the gods of the underworld, stood before Osiris, and was weighed upon the scales of Ma'at. But how could the balance waver? The heart of a god-king, pure in its devotion to order, outweighed even the feather of truth. The verdict was inevitable, justified, triumphant, eternal. The priests sealed the final chamber, their chants echoing off walls painted with scenes of stars and boats, serpents and sun discs. The light of their torches flickered across the golden mask that hid his face. Then they extinguished the flames, leaving the king to his rest. Outside, the silence of the desert settled like a shroud, but Egypt did not rest. Life flowed on, shaped by the legacy he had left. The temples he had built continued their rituals. The canals he had dug nourished the fields. The statues he had raised watched over the land. Generations would pass before any hand dared alter what he had created. His image became a fixed part of Egypt's landscape, inseparable from its sky and sand. Even foreign travelers who came centuries later, Greeks, Persians, Romans, would stand before his monuments and marvel, speaking his name as though it were a natural feature of the world. Merneptah ruled with dignity, though the shadow of his father stretched long. The empire Ramses had built was still powerful, but it had grown old, its boundaries less certain. The first stirrings of the sea peoples began to trouble the coasts, and famine swept the eastern lands. Egypt, still rich in memory, had to defend itself now with vigilance rather than pride. The great machine of empire moved, but more slowly, its joints worn by time. Still, the faith of the people endured. When foreign raiders threatened the delta, the priests carried statues of Ramses through the streets, calling upon his spirit to protect the realm. The winds shifted, the invaders fell, and Egypt survived. "He guards us even in death," they said. His legend became a shield stronger than any wall. In the centuries that followed, dynasties rose and fell. New kings took his name as a title of legitimacy, Ramses III, Ramses IV, and others, echoing the divine ancestor. Yet none matched the original's magnitude. His monuments remained the standard against which all ambition was measured, and his name, Ramses the Great, became less a memory than a myth. When Greek historians later spoke of him, they called him Ozymandias, and travellers recited the words carved into his ruined statue. "Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair." But the irony that echoed through foreign tongues missed the truth. His despair was not the vanity of power, but the humility of endurance. He had known all along that time would erode stone, that kingdoms would fade, yet he built so that the shape of order would remain long after the names of conquerors and merchants turned to dust. Deep in his tomb, the paintings still glowed in torchlight centuries later when tomb robbers stumbled upon them. The colours, preserved by dry air and devotion, still spoke of the sun's journey and the pharaoh's rebirth. The thieves took the gold, but they could not take the meaning. Even stripped of jewels, the tomb radiated calm, the calm of one who had accepted mortality and turned it into monument. His mummy, discovered millennia later, still bore the serenity of that understanding. The face, with its aquiline nose and resolute mouth, retained a majesty that neither age nor death could erase. Scientists who unwrapped him in modern light felt the awe that ancient priests must have known. Here lay the man who had once commanded armies and built mountains, who had loved and lost, who had turned time itself into his servant. Ramses had been mortal, yes, but he had mastered mortality by living as if every breath were a brick in the wall of eternity. His reign proved that immortality was not the absence of death, but the endurance of meaning. He had built not merely temples, but a memory so vast that even when the sands covered his works, his name still echoed in the minds of men. In the end, Egypt itself became his afterlife. The Nile carried his story from century to century. The desert guarded his monuments like watchful sentinels, and the sky above remained unchanged, the same deep, eternal blue under which he had once stood. Every time the sun rose over the temples of Thebes or touched the faces of Abu Simbel, his spirit stirred in the light. He had promised that his name would live forever, and it did. The whispers of his legend travelled beyond the desert, beyond the sea, into the ages where even gods faded, but his image remained. Ramses, the great mortal, immortal, eternal, the king who built forever, and in doing so, became it. The kingdom after the king. When the golden sarcophagus of Ramses the Great was sealed in the cool silence of his tomb, Egypt felt for the first time in nearly a century the faint tremor of uncertainty. The air itself seemed different, lighter, less sure. The Nile still flowed, the temples still gleamed, but something had changed in the rhythm of the world. The god who had walked among men was gone, and the land stood still, listening for his voice in the wind. Merneptah, his son and chosen heir, ascended the throne with solemn grace. He was already an old man over 60 years of age, his hair grey, his face lined by years of quiet loyalty. He had waited a lifetime beneath the shadow of his father's glory, and now that the moment had come, it was both crown and burden. The empire he inherited was vast but weary, strong but aging, bound together less by conquest than by memory. The priests proclaimed the new pharaoh as Merneptah, beloved of Ma'at, son of Ra, heir of the great Ramses. Yet everywhere he went, the people bowed and whispered the same words, "May the Great One guide him." Ramses's spirit hovered in every corner of the kingdom, in every temple wall and every spoken prayer. The living still walked in the shadow of the dead, and that shadow was immense. Merneptah's reign began with signs of both peace and peril. The borders to the south remained loyal. Nubia still sent gold and tribute, but the western frontier stirred with restlessness. The Libyan tribes, long kept at bay by Ramses's armies, gathered once more along the desert fringe. To the north, across the sea, the first dark waves of the mysterious sea peoples began to rise, bands of displaced warriors, their origins unknown, moving like storm clouds toward the coasts of the known world. Egypt, though still mighty, no longer possessed the limitless energy of Ramses's youth. The long peace had dulled its edges. Its temples and granaries grew heavy with wealth, but slow in vigilance. Merneptah, cautious but decisive, called upon the remnants of his father's armies, summoning charioteers and archers from across the delta. The old generals, men who had once served under Ramses, tightened their belts and took command once more. They marched west to meet the invading Libyans near the fields of Perea. The battle was fierce and sudden. The Libyan king Merier led his forces boldly, supported by mercenaries from the sea peoples, men with strange helmets, bronze swords, and long ships that haunted the coasts. The two armies clashed in clouds of dust and cries. Arrows filled the air, the ground shook beneath the charge of chariots. Yet Egypt's discipline, forged by centuries of command, prevailed. The Libyan horde was shattered. Their leader fled into the sands. Merneptah returned to Pyramses in triumph, and though the victory was his, the people saw it as the will of Ramses continuing through his son. To commemorate the victory, Merneptah ordered inscriptions carved upon the temple walls. One of them would become famous through the ages, the Israel Stele, the earliest known mention of the people of Israel, carved in proud hieroglyphs declaring, "Israel is laid waste, his seed is no more." The words were typical of Egypt's triumphal style, yet their survival through millennia spoke to the enduring reach of Ramses's empire, even in its twilight. Though victorious, Merneptah ruled with moderation. He understood that Egypt could no longer rely on endless expansion. Its strength now lay in preservation of faith, of order, of memory. He restored temples, reorganized the priesthood, and continued to honor his father's cult. Each year, offerings were made at the Ramesseum. Priests lit lamps before statues of Ramses and recited hymns in his name. "He reigns still among the stars," they intoned. "He opens the gates of the dawn for his son." But time, relentless and impartial, continued its quiet erosion. After Merneptah's death, his successors faced storms that neither armies nor prayers could fully repel. Famine swept the land as the Nile failed to flood in its full measure. The sea peoples pressed southward, ravaging the shores of the Mediterranean. The Hittite Empire, once Egypt's equal, collapsed under their onslaught, leaving a vacuum of chaos in its wake. The Bronze Age, the age of Ramses, was ending. Yet within Egypt, the monuments of the Great One still stood, defying the passage of years. The people looked upon them and felt reassurance. As long as the colossal statues of Abu Simbel stared out across the Nubian cliffs, as long as the pylons of Luxor caught the rising sun, Egypt would endure. Even when new dynasties rose and fell, each claiming divine sanction, they did so beneath the gaze of Ramses the Great, whose name was already legend. Generations after his death, artisans continued to copy his inscriptions, sculptors to model his features, scribes to imitate his style. His image became the standard of kingship. To be pharaoh was to emulate Ramses, to be just, to be strong, to be eternal. None equaled him, yet all sought to wear his reflection. In distant centuries, priests in Thebes still invoked his spirit during coronation rites, whispering his titles as blessings upon new rulers. His memory had become religion itself. But even monuments must bow before the desert. The city of Pyramses, once gleaming with canals and palaces, began to decline. The shifting course of the Nile starved it of water, and its fields turned to dust. The court moved north to Tanis, carrying with it the statues and stones of the old capital, reassembling them like sacred relics. The heart of Ramses's empire became a ghost of itself, yet the stones still bore his name, and so the ghost still spoke. Centuries later, when foreign powers, Persians, Greeks, Romans, entered Egypt, they stood before his temples in awe. Even conquerors bowed their heads. Alexander the Great, upon seeing the monuments of Thebes, declared that no man before him had equalled Ramses. The Roman emperors sent sculptors to study his colossi. His fame had transcended time, language, and faith. Through the passing of dynasties, Egypt's spirit never escaped his gravity. The people still told stories of the king who ruled 100 years, who built mountains and moved rivers. They said that when he died, Ra himself wept, and the desert bloomed for 40 days. Others swore that his soul still rose with the sun, watching over the two lands from the heavens. Children played in the shadow of his statues, and mothers told them, "That is the Great One who guards us." It is really forting, and so the centuries layered upon his name, turning man into myth, myth into memory, and memory into eternity. Even when his tomb was robbed, even when his mummy was hidden away by later priests to save it from desecration, his presence remained unbroken. In the secret caches of Thebes, the priests whispered his name as they wrapped his body anew, praying that his rest might continue undisturbed until the end of ages. They could not have imagined that 3,000 years later he would rise again, not in spirit, but in sight. When archaeologists unsealed the royal cache in 1881, they found his body, perfectly preserved. The face that had once commanded the ancient world emerged from the linen, serene, proud, still bearing the dignity of the sun. His skin was bronze, his hair tinged with red, his jaw strong even in death. Those who looked upon him felt, for a moment, the echo of eternity. The world had changed beyond recognition, but Ramses had not. His gaze, though long stilled, carried the weight of a man who had built time into stone and found within it immortality. He had become what he always intended to be, not a king of a single age, but a king of all ages. His temples might crumble, his cities might sink beneath sand, but his spirit remained in every sunrise over the Nile, every grain of desert gold, every whisper of wind through ancient columns. For as long as the river flows, the name of Ramses the Great endures. The sleep of stone. 3,000 years passed like a dream. The empire of Ramses crumbled to dust. The gods fell silent, and foreign tongues filled the streets where once the hymns of Amun had echoed. Greece rose, then Rome, then the caliphs and kings of distant lands, all leaving their marks upon the same earth that had once belonged solely to Egypt. But through it all, Ramses slept. His temples still stood in the sand, eroded but defiant, the faces of their colossi, weathered by wind yet unbowed. The great king's image, endured long after the memories of his rivals had vanished into nameless centuries. The desert is cruel and kind in equal measure. It devours the living but preserves the dead. Beneath its endless dunes, the relics of the new kingdom slumbered, untouched by time. The tombs of Thebes lay sealed in the Valley of Kings, their corridors still painted with the colours of eternity. The city of Pyramses was gone, swallowed by shifting Nile channels, its stones carried away to new capitals. Yet in the far south, carved into the cliffs of Nubia, the colossi of Abu Simbel remained. For ages, travellers from the desert tribes spoke of them giant seated figures gazing eastward, their faces half buried, their crowns broken but their majesty undiminished. They called the site Ipsambul, and they told stories of ancient gods turned to stone. Few dared to approach, for it was said that when the wind blew through the cliffs, the statues whispered. They did whisper, though only with the voice of the wind. Sand drifted over the temple's threshold, sealing it gradually until only the heads of the colossi were visible above the desert floor. The rising sun still struck their faces each morning, but the interior, where once light had pierced the darkness to illuminate Ramses beside the gods, fell into eternal night. The temple became a tomb of its own, the stone heart of an empire forgotten by the world. But the silence was not death. Time has its own rhythm, and history, like the Nile, always returns to its source. In the early years of the 19th century, explorers from the far lands of Europe came seeking the lost wonders of Egypt. The names of the ancient pharaohs had become myth, their language unreadable, their gods reduced to curiosities. Yet whispers persisted, legends of colossal statues half buried in sand, of cities of gold beneath the desert. The Western world hungered to uncover the past, and Egypt, the eternal, began to awaken. Among those who came was Giovanni Belzoni, a giant of a man from Padua, engineer, adventurer, dreamer. In 1817, guided by Bedouins through the Nubian cliffs, he found Abu Simbel buried to the chin in sand. For weeks he laboured beneath the merciless sun, digging by hand and pulley until at last the entrance was revealed. When his torch pierced the darkness for the first time in more than 2 millennia, its light fell upon the carved walls, the battles, the gods, the king himself, untouched, waiting. Belzoni stood silent before the colossal images, awed by the perfection of the art, the grandeur of the vision. "It is the work of giants," he wrote later, and the soul of immortality seems still to breathe within it. The modern world had rediscovered Ramses the Great. Scholars soon followed, brushing the dust from inscriptions, copying hieroglyphs they could not yet read. A few years later, when Champollion unlocked the secret of hieroglyphs through the Rosetta Stone, the silent walls began to speak, and what they said astonished the world. The pharaoh, who had been a mystery, became a man once more, his name, Uzamatra Setepenre Ramses Meriamun, rolling again upon human tongues. The carvings told of Kadesh, of treaties, of temples and gods, of his beloved Nefertari, of peace and power. The story of a forgotten age unfolded in the flicker of lamplight on sandstone walls. Abu Simbel became a pilgrimage for the curious and the devout. Travellers crossed deserts to stand before its colossi and feel the weight of 3,000 years press upon them. Some wept, some knelt, all were silent. The face of Ramses, even eroded and cracked, still carried the calm of a being who had seen eternity and found it familiar. Meanwhile, in the north, the tomb of Ramses, once hidden and looted, was rediscovered by chance. His mummy, along with dozens of others, had been reburied by later priests in a secret cache at Deir el-Bahari to save them from thieves. When archaeologists unsealed the cache in 1881, they found him there among the kings Seti, Thutmose, Ahmose, all laid together in silent dignity. When the wrappings were removed and the lamplight touched his face, a breath seemed to pass through history itself. The features were unmistakable. The proud jaw, the high nose, the trace of red in his hair. the calm upon the lips. Even after 3,000 years, he was still Ramses, the face that had ruled the ancient world. One observer wrote, "It is not a corpse we behold, but a presence sleeping, not dead." The world that uncovered him was one of steamships and scholars, yet his image struck them with the same awe that had gripped peasants on the banks of the Nile in his own time. His body was carried to Cairo, where he was studied, measured, and revered. When he was later flown to Paris for restoration in 1976, the Egyptian government issued him a passport, listing his occupation simply as king deceased. At the airport, he was received with full military honours. Even the modern world bowed to him. In the museums of the West, visitors stared through glass at his preserved form. Children whispered in a dozen languages. Artists sketched his profile. Historians traced his lineage. For the first time in 3 millennia, his story had crossed from myth into fact, and in doing so, had become legend once again. But Ramses himself remained where he had always been, between time and timelessness, between man and God. His temples stood unmoved, his name still clear upon their walls. The desert wind that once whispered through Abu Simbel still passed across his lips each dawn, carrying grains of sand that glowed like gold in the rising sun. He had dreamed of immortality, and he had achieved it not through divinity, not through conquest, but through endurance. Every empire after his would rise and fall, every god after his would fade. Yet his face, carved from the bones of the earth, still watched the horizon as if expecting the dawn of creation itself. And the dawn always came. Each morning, the sun struck the cliffs of Abu Simbel, and for a few brief moments, the light poured through the temple's inner sanctum. The beam touched the statues of Ra, Amun, and Ramses, illuminating them in gold before fading again into shadow. It had done so for over 3,000 years, unbroken by time, unbowed by ruin. The gods had kept their promise. In that brief moment of light, as the sun met the stone, the dream of Ramses lived again, the dream of a man who refused to vanish. He was not merely remembered, he was present. Even now, when travellers stand before his temples, they hear nothing but the wind. Yet within that silence lies something vast, a pulse, a rhythm, the slow heartbeat of eternity that he once embodied. The Pharaoh still keeps his vigil. The desert still guards his throne, the eternal light. The sun has risen over Egypt for more than 3,000 years, since Ramses the Great closed his eyes to mortal dawn. Yet still, each morning, as its first light touches the river and the ruins, it seems to remember him. The temples awaken in silence, their carved gods glowing faintly in the warmth. The statues of the Pharaoh, weathered but proud, gaze eastward as they always have. The Nile moves on, slow and shining, carrying the memory of his empire through the heart of the land he shaped. Ramses had sought eternity, and eternity had answered, not with thunder, but with endurance. The age of pharaohs is long past, the language of hieroglyphs now taught in quiet rooms, its secrets deciphered by distant minds. The gods he worshipped no longer receive offerings beneath the stars. Their names are known now only as poetry and myth. But what he built still stands. The walls of Luxor and Karnak still echo with his stories. Abu Simbel still waits each year for the sunbeam to reach its heart. And in museums and books, in classrooms and films, in the imaginations of those who dream of the past, Ramses still reigns. His life has become more than history, it is symbol, the embodiment of human ambition, beauty, and impermanence. A reminder that power can be shaped into art, and art can outlast all power. When travellers walk among the ruins at Thebes or gaze up at the colossi of Abu Simbel, they do not see only stone. They see the hand of a man who lived in harmony with the eternal. The precision of the carvings, the symmetry of the temples, the calm of his statues, these are not the boasts of a conqueror, but the meditations of one who understood the fragile balance between death and immortality. He had lived as a god among men, yet he died as all men do. And still, his dream was fulfilled, not because he escaped death, but because he accepted it and built within it a home for his spirit. The tombs of Thebes whisper the same truth through their painted corridors, that the afterlife is not beyond the world, but within it, preserved in memory, in art, in love, in legacy. Ramses's life became that philosophy made manifest. His reign was not simply long, it was complete. Every battle, every temple, every act of devotion was a piece of the same design, the pursuit of permanence through harmony. And though his temples crumble, the idea remains. In the early light of modern Egypt, as the call to prayer drifts over the same river where the priests once sang hymns to Ra, the presence of the old gods still hums beneath the surface. The lotus still blooms at sunrise, the herons still lift from the reeds, the fishermen still cast their nets where his fleets once sailed. The rhythm has not changed, the land itself remembers. There is a certain peace in that, the quiet triumph of continuity. The pharaoh who once commanded armies and raised mountains now rules only in silence, but that silence is vast. It extends across centuries, binding the ancient to the living. Tourists stand in the heat, their eyes raised to the colossal faces carved in stone, and they feel, for a moment, something wordless. Awe, perhaps, or belonging. For though the sands shift, the essence of Egypt remains what Ramses always believed it to be, a meeting between heaven and earth, between the transient and the eternal. His story, when told now, is not merely a chronicle of conquest or kingship. It is the story of endurance, the lesson that even mortal hands can shape the infinite. He was a man, yes, a husband who mourned, a father who aged, a warrior who bled. But through those human frailties, he touched something beyond them. His temples were his prayers, his cities his heartbeat, his people his reflection. When they spoke his name, they gave him life, and they still do. Every word spoken about him, every image studied, every monument restored, these are offerings, as sacred in their way as the incense burned in Thebes long ago. They keep the sun upon his face, the light within his tomb. There is a line carved deep within his mortuary temple, now barely legible. I have made these things to last for eternity. My name shall endure as long as the sky endures. And it has. The sky above his kingdom remains the same blue it was in his day, vast and merciful, stretching from the deserts of Nubia to the Mediterranean Sea. Beneath it, life continues different in form, the same in essence. Farmers still look to the river for promise. Children still laugh in the sand. The sun still glows red as it sets behind the cliffs of Thebes. Ramses lives in that light, not in the marble halls of museums, nor in the brittle pages of scholars, but in the rhythm of each dawn that touches the Nile. His legacy was never only stone, it was balance, endurance, beauty. It was the realization that a single life, lived with devotion to order and wonder, can ripple endlessly through time. He remains, as the ancient texts once called him, the strong bull, beloved of Ma'at, not because his armies conquered the earth, but because his vision conquered death. His kingdom was not merely Egypt, it was the idea that harmony could outlast decay. And so, each morning, when the sun rises over the desert and the wind moves softly through the temples, Egypt breathes his name, not as prayer, not as memory, but as truth. The light falls upon the faces of the gods and upon the calm features of the man who built forever. The sand glows gold, the air trembles, the silence deepens. Ramses the Great endures,